Good evening, night walkers. Are you ready to look someone in the face and not be sure it's theirs? Settle in, breathe once, and tell me, if a mask mirrors fear perfectly, is it still only a mask? You're listening to Somnolent Conspiracies, where we invite you to lean closer, ask hard questions, and keep your courage within reach. Tonight's case comes from Havana, in a townhouse 2 streets off the Malecon where salt eats iron and music spills through shutters. A private collector kept a room of wax faces. Actors, saints, criminals, strangers. They were lifelike in the way the sea is lifelike, shifting even when you swear it's still. After a string of violent deaths, the masks began to update. A grin became a rictus. Calm mouths thinned into terror. The brow of a revolutionary, once serene, held a crease that matched the morgue photograph of a tourist dead the night before. The police sealed the collection. The owner argued chemistry and heat. Neighbors whispered about Santeria and debts the living owed the dead. Our detective believes in chain of custody, in what wax does at certain temperatures, and in how lies leave fingerprints on air. She'll test for volatile oils, read microcrystal scars under a microscope, and ask why the expressions don't change randomly, but in lockstep with victims whose names the curator should not know. All right, coffee within reach, lights a little lower. If the face on the wall starts to resemble you, don't blink. Let's see who is wearing whom. The courtyard of Vega House looked like a throat. Narrow walls the color of nicotine, a square of hard sky at the top, and a wet stone tongue that led inward to a door with a broken bell. Grace Navarro pressed the button anyway out of habit. Somewhere inside, something clicked without ringing. She could smell salt and bay leaf and something sweeter laid over them like a suggestion. Clove and alcohol, a cologne the color of memory. Martin Vega opened the door by degrees, as if he were measuring out a favor. He was taller than the rumor, shorter than his shadow. The light behind him made a halo of wool around his hair. He smiled with all the humility of a host and none of the apology of a suspect. "Detective Navarro," he said, and extended a palm that glistened at the edges. "I appreciate your fast attention." "Consultant," Grace corrected. She shook his hand and felt the superstitious pride of a man who handles delicate things without ever dropping them. "Your collection is sealed until I say otherwise. You understand. My work requires air more than permission," he said, stepping aside. "But I will hold my breath." The entry hall had the hush of money that pretends to be culture. Framed playbills leaned into signed photographs. A piano sat with its lid up like a waiting mouth. Somewhere a fan turned, and the moving air carried that sweet afterscent again. Bay rum, she thought. Old-school barbershops, leather straps, hot towels. It didn't belong to the wall color or the clean floor. It belonged to skin. 3 homicides, she said as they walked. Emily Cross, Peter Hale, Sophie Lane. You hosted each of them at some point in the last month. "I host the city," Vega said. "Sometimes it pays, sometimes it bites. Emily Cross argued with you about a private viewing fee. Peter Hale supplied your ice at a discount, then cut you off. Sophie Lane filed a memo flagging your collection as problematic. You knew all 3. Now show me how their faces ended up in wax." He glanced at her with a resignation that could have been charm. "My masks move like ships move, only if the tide lifts them. Heat, humidity, Havana's hand." They reached the gallery door. A strip of red evidence tape ran down the jamb, initialed by a patrol officer who had thought a strip of tape could stop a story. Grace slid a fresh seal across it to mark her chain of custody, then cut the old one with a scalpel. The door sighed. The room breathed. Wax, when it is faithful, reflects too much. The first impression was the color of flesh with the life scooped out. Heads on pedestals, faces in shadow boxes, noses that had memorized wind, ears sculpted for gossip. A dozen saints, 3 criminals, an opera singer caught forever midway between applause and the fall of the curtain. Every head set at a height that would catch and hold a curious eye. Grace's gaze caught on 3. A woman's grimace, that burst of teeth and sinew you only see in photographs you don't show families. A man's lower lip drawn inward, a crescent of enamel where he'd bitten it. A young woman's left eye squinting down the way a thread pulls when you tug the wrong seam. Emily Cross, Peter Hale, Sophie Lane. The morgue images had logged all those details. Confidential, controlled, chained. She knew because she had read the autopsy reports in a room with ventless light and counted the stitches that closed the world back up. She knew because only certain people had touched those faces between death and the drawer. "Before you ask," Vega said, reading where she stood, "I didn't change them. Wax sweats, muscles sag. Temperatures in Havana travel miles in an hour." Grace held up a hand. Silence first. Observation second. Conclusions at the door. The air in the room was cooler than the hall. A grid of vents along the baseboards gleamed faintly. The floorboards had been waxed in a sheen that ended shy of slick. The windows, barred and shuttered, wore a dust the color of book pages that had just begun to surrender. Candles stood in brass cups along the walls, their wicks white and unused, their sides clean. Ritual props placed to be seen. She crouched near a pedestal and let her eyes fall half-closed until edges honed. A faint irregularity near the nose-to-mouth crease, on Emily's mask, like the wake of something dragged at a shallow angle. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to. A microdrag could be a rumor in material, the smallest confession. She stood. "Lights to neutral," she said. Vega gestured at a dimmer. The bulbs cooled to a winter noon. Details arrived the way stars appear in reverse. Tool shadows, seam lines, the subtle dulling where a hand had breathed too close. "Who else has access?" she asked. "My assistant, Leo," Vega said. "And the city. Its breath comes through my vents." He smiled again, thin. "But keys? Only I keep them. Weekdays, Leo opens with me." Grace walked the perimeter, counting vents, counting cameras, counting what a confident man forgets to hide. A small black eye in the corner watched the room indifferently. She noted the angle, wide enough to flatter donors, not close enough to shame a craftsman at work. The camera wouldn't have seen a tool if the tool were the color of patience. "Where is your HVAC controller?" she asked. "In the office," Vega said. "It's old. When it fails, the wax complains." "We'll read it," Grace said. She took a step into the middle of the room and lifted her chin slightly, as if scent rose higher than sight. There it was again, the bay rum, an aftershave mixed with something fattier, sheep wool and pharmacy. Lanolin. Not a sculptor's medium and not a cleaner's either, unless the cleaner wanted the light to sit on the surface just so. "Candles unlit," she said, half to herself. "Perfume present. Vents clean. Temperature lower than outside. Explain the lower lip, Mr. Vega. Explain the squint." He lifted his hands and let them fall. "You came here to take my art away," he said without heat. "But you will not take the way air speaks to it. The saints used to weep. What is this but a different sacrament?" "Save the Mass," Grace said. "I'm here to inventory what's mine, not argue what's yours." She called in her kit. The evidence techs she worked with knew how she liked a room. Frozen in place. They brought canisters that exhaled cold. They brought foggers that mapped air the way sailors map currents. She logged each mask by number, position, angle, and the height of the pedestal in centimeters. She photographed them in raking light and in soft, fronted light. She measured distance to vents, distance to candles, distance to the lie that everything stays where we put it. When she was done with photographs, she stood in the doorway and let the cold run. The display cases breathed a thin ghost. The wax lost its whisper of skin and became honest. Condensation beaded on glass, not on faces. The room surrendered its curve. Vega watched with his arms folded as if he were the one chilled. "You'll crack them," he said. "I'll stop them," she said. "If wax moved, something moved it. Heat, hands, or pressure. I don't see saints. I see causes." He moved closer to Emily's mask and then caught himself. You don't reach when the person with the seals is watching. His hands hovered, his fingertips making a small theater of restraint. "You think I staged grief," he said. "Did you ever consider that grief stages us? Hawks us, hounds us, arranges us to fit its frame?" "Every day," Grace said. That's why I don't let it do the evidence. She finished labeling the pedestals and walked to the small door marked mechanical. Locked. Vega produced a key with an almost concealed reluctance. Inside, the ductwork showed a stainless steel prudery. A controller panel blinked with a series of small numbers that meant little until they meant everything. Spikes at irregular intervals. Higher than the comfortable range for people, lower than a kiln, sharp and localized. Zones. You'll print those logs, Grace said, and give me the maintenance schedule. Of course, he said. I am not your villain, Ms. Navarro. I am your frame. Frames keep pictures steady, she said. We'll see if you do. A police painter could have stood there and captured the moment. The consultant, the collector, the frozen faces. Grace preferred not to be captured. She stepped out, used her phone to call a standby forensic chemist, and ordered microswabs along the nasolabial lines of masks 22, 28, and 31, the three that had learned too much. She had them bag the bayrum air itself in sorbent tubes, had them lift trace from the vents, had them tape lift the pedestal's edges where impatience leaves its impatient film. Seal it, she said when they were done. Red tape crossed the door like a mute X. She pressed her initials into the overlap and felt the gummy resistance of protocol. When the door closed, the room became someone else's memory. Vega stood again in the hall with the piano. He touched its lid as if it were a living shoulder. Grace noticed the bench. A hairline crack along the underside, almost hidden. A strip of old adhesive where something once lay flush. She said nothing. Not yet. Not until the numbers in the mechanical closet and the scent in the air became statements instead of suggestions. Tomorrow, Vega said, hopeful like a host recovering the evening. I could show you the saints at dusk. The light. Tomorrow, Grace said, we'll test your air and ask your assistant about keys. Tonight, you'll go nowhere near that door. Where would I go? He smiled at the piano. I live where my faces live. Grace stepped into the courtyard again. The sky had turned the color of metal coughing up blood at sunset. The wind smelled like salt and electricity, and far away the Malecon threw back the sea as if that were something people were allowed to do. She made a note to herself and a second, quieter note on paper she didn't intend to share. If wax moved, something moved it. Heat, hands, or pressure. Heat I can catch. Hands leave residue. Pressure leaves pattern. She tucked the note away. Behind her, the house cleared its throat. The sweet afterscent clung to her sleeve. Bayrum and lanolin, or a story with skin on it. Order environmental and trace tests. Freeze the theater until the actors admit they were on stage. The lab at Major Crimes was a submarine without water. Metal corridors, low hum, faces that surfaced out of fluorescence and disappeared again. Grace carried the evidence courier pouch like a priest might carry a small reluctant god. Inside, air in tubes, swabs along wax smiles, tape lifts from pedestals, and a scent she could taste on her molars when she breathed through her mouth. Evan Ward looked up from a coffee that had cooled to the color of paper. He wore the indifferent beard of a man who measured days in runs and rinses. You brought me a perfumery, he said, standing. Or a church. Depends who you ask, Grace said, handing him the chain of custody forms and the bagged swabs. Masks that honor the dead by stealing their faces. Start with composition, then scent, then anything that looks like a human touch pretending to be heat. Ward's eyebrows did a small polite shrug that meant he would do it anyway. He slid the swabs onto labeled trays and tapped his pencil against the tubes. 2 beats, a pause, 2 beats again. Somewhere down the hall, a centrifuge agreed. Wax first, he said. I'll shave a hair off the backside of one sample for DSC. You want a non-destructive read. He already knew the answer. Wax hates being cut, Grace said, but it hates ignorance more. He smiled without enjoying it and drew a sliver with a scalpel so sharp the air divided with it. He fed the curl into the differential scanning calorimeter, sealed the tiny crucible, and woke the machine. The screen plotted a slope that would be boring unless you believed in what a curve can say about a room. Softening onset, Ward murmured, tracing the baseline with a fingernail above the glass. You see that shoulder? Beeswax blended with a petroleum fraction paraffin, plus a strengthening agent. Carnauba, I'm going to bet. It gives it a gloss and a higher scratch resistance. He read the heat flow numbers and jotted them on the worksheet. Softening point in this sample, mid-50s Celsius. Call it 54 to 58 for the blend. You can sag a smile at 48 if you're patient and localized, but faces won't travel at 32. 32, Grace said. Room never shows above that for the last month. Logs argue the masks should be loyal. Logs argue what the logger saw, Ward said. They don't speak for the vents. He had the GC/MS warmed for the volatile capture tubes. He loaded air from the gallery into the instrument and stood there, arms folded, like a man waiting for a riddle to reveal the word knife. The chromatogram arrived in a forest of peaks that looked like a city scene from a plane at night. Ward pointed with the pencil. That's your bay rum. Mostly alcohol base, usually ethanol or isopropyl, with essential oil components, pimenta racemosa, clove, a little allspice. And this lanolin, not an odor compound by itself, but the volatiles carry over. Sheep wool fat. It's in hand creams. It's also a plasticizer if you're cheating a surface into behaving. Not a sculptor's medium, Grace said. Not unless the sculptor also shaves in the same room. He slid the tape lifts under a stereoscope and dialed the light down until dust acquired architecture. Pedestal edge has fine wax flakes. Last 24 hours. See the fracture faces? They're brittle, not droplet. The flakes weren't melted off. They were planed. Microscrapes along a nasolabial line, here. He switched to the SEM to make the small thing enormous. Under electron light, the wax looked like a fallen glacier. Ward traced the striations with the cursor. You don't get these from air. These are drag marks. Narrow tool, rounded tip. Not a chisel, more like a dental spatula, microheated, worked along the crease. And the drag is clean, not dust-laden. I'd put the manipulation at a day, maybe a day and a half. There's still bloom in the trough. Sterile alcohol or a relative. Somebody primed or burnished after tooling. Time window is good, Grace said. 2 of the murders sit in it. The residue in the striations, Ward went on, carries that same bay rum signature, and lanolin, and here trace sterile alcohol, common in hair products, cosmetics. Together with carnauba in the blend, it gives you a surface that takes a thumb better than it should. He spun from the scope to the evidence form and initialed the findings. 2 masks with microdrag along the nasolabial lines, both within 36 hours. And if I had the rest in here for a week, I'd find your practice arcs too. Practice arcs, Grace repeated, liking the phrase, on faces that are supposed to be still. Ward shrugged. Stillness is labor. People think it's the absence of touch. It's the proof that touch was careful. Grace left him with the vow of more samples to come and took the elevator down with the scent still ghosting the back of her throat. On the drive back to Vega House, she let Havana pour past the windows. Blue where it wanted to be, salt white where it couldn't help it. Balconies with ironwork that looked like long sentences left to rust. Leo Brooks, the assistant, stood outside the courtyard gate with a cigarette he didn't seem to know what to do with. He was the age that waits by doors. He stiffened when he saw her and then decided not to run. Mr. Vega's not here, he said. I don't need Mr. Vega, Grace said. I need your mechanical closet. He blinked. The what? Where the house breathes, she said, and let him lead her through. The gallery remained sealed, its tape neat and stubborn. The hallway's cool was a different cool today, anticipatory. Grace unlocked the mechanical door and watched Leo's eyes on her hands, as if the keys were a deck he wanted to learn the trick to. Inside, the ductwork held itself in the same stainless poise. But it's hard to hide intent from a person who has ever repaired her own air conditioner with a borrowed meter in August. Grace crouched, squinted, and found the thing that didn't belong. A short length of new flexible duct spliced into the older run, leading to a small box with fins and a cable that went not to the main controller but into the cavity behind the wall. What's that? She asked, and because he hesitated, said, the correct answer is a problem. Leo swallowed. Supplemental heat. Mr. Vega said the wax complained in damp weather. Supplemental controlled by what? She followed the cable with 2 fingers and saw the bare edge of a hole patched hurriedly and smoothed with paint. She pried it with a flat screwdriver from her pocket knife and eased the box out. A resistance heater, compact, industrial. She traced the other cable to a neat rectangle mounted under duct labels. A small PID controller with its own thermostat bead taped to the output side of the finned box, not the room. Grace scrolled the controller menu with cautious contempt. The display gave her the cynical clarity of numbers. Set point 58 Celsius, modulation by pulse width, output limited. Zones labeled with short names, each corresponding to a diffuser position she remembered along the baseboards in the gallery. Mask-only warming, she said. You can heat a smile without heating the air your donors breathe. Leo tried a shrug on, and it didn't fit him. We were correcting sag. You were melting evidence, she said. Where's the remote that changes these settings? He looked at the floor in a way that made the answer too slow. It's manual. Nothing this tidy is manual. She straightened and took in the labels, Zone A, Zone B, Zone C, each with calibration offsets. A thin wire ran to a small antenna that pretended to be a ground clamp. RF capable, she said, so someone can warm a single zone from the piano without standing in the heat. She stepped back into the hall and looked at the piano bench again. The underside adhesive scar waited like a faded bruise. She slid a hand under and found nothing, the absence that points forward. Who installed it? She asked. Delivery came for me to sign, Leo said. Heater, controller, the flex, clamps, tap. I have the invoice. Where from? A place that sells lab gear, he said, helpless, adding honesty to the end of the sentence as if it could tip the scale. Get me the invoice, Grace said. And your hands. He frowned. My hands. She produced a small UV flashlight and shone it across his fingers. At the webbing between thumb and forefinger on his right hand, the skin had the smoothness of recent heat. Micro burns that didn't blister, the kind a person earns by working too close to something that remembers fingerprints. On his left index, a faint crescent reddening where a warm tool's shaft meets skin if you steady it too long. You've been close to warm wax, she said. I polish, he said. Mr. Vega asks me to polish. Bayrum on a cloth, a little hand cream. It wakes the surface. It also wakes the evidence. She took swabs along his fingertips and bagged them. You'll give me your purchase orders for the last 6 months. Anything with the words wand, spatula, controller, PID, silicone, or practice. He flinched at the last word. Grace left him in the hall at a loss and stepped back into the mechanical closet one more time, the way you step again into a room you've already decided to leave. It's easy to mistake a device for a mind, but devices exist because minds want what hands can't do alone. She photographed the controller, the labels, the tape sensor bead, the spliced resistance heater with its heatsink fins. She measured the distance from the heater to the branch that fed the vent beneath Emily's pedestal. She logged the set points and the narrowness of the control band. She bagged a square of flex duct tape, because men who build secrets leave skin where the adhesive requires. Outside, Havana had begun its daily rehearsal of becoming night. The air was the same temperature as skin. Grace closed the closet and pressed a fresh evidence seal over the door jamb, her initials cutting the gummy line. In her notebook, she set the day's equation. Beeswax, paraffin with carnauba, stearyl alcohol residuum, softening mid-50s degree C. Room logs lie by omission. SEM shows microdrag along nasolabial lines within 24 to 36 hours. Residue, lanolin plus bayrum. Duct hides a resistance heater and PID controller targeted to mask-only zones. She underlined the last line twice. If wax moved, something moved it. Heat mattered. But heat without hands is only weather. Hands leave touch. Touch leaves trace. The city's breath could warp a saint. But a saint doesn't learn a tourist's last grimace on its own. She looked at the piano, the bench, the tidy hall with its pretend museum calm. Somewhere between the controller's set point and the mask's new mouth lay a thumbprint with an opinion. She intended to shake its hand. The afternoon light on Calle San Lazaro was the color of old brass and hard liquor poured through dusty glass. Grace parked where the curb had given up and walked back to Vega House with a warrant that could open everything short of the sea. The courtyard swallowed noise like a practiced liar. She pressed the buzzer. It clicked again without ringing, a private joke told by a piece of wire. Martin Vega opened as if nothing inconvenient ever arrived at his door. His shirt was linen the color of smoke. His sleeves rolled to confess capable forearms. His eyes rehearsed at being kind. "Ms. Navarro," he said, "you bring weather. I bring paper," she answered, holding the warrant, and watched the little detour his gaze took to avoid it. "Your office, Mr. Vega." Now. The office had the nervous tidiness of a desk staged for a magazine. Fountain pens aligned by nib width, books shelved by spine tone, a small brass skull that smiled without permission. The window faced a wall so close you could count the flaked blues in the paint. Air gathered in the corners like a plan. Grace set the warrant on the desk blotter, let it sit a second for weight, then turned to the door. "Leo." He appeared from the hall, the cigarette replaced by the posture of a boy at a door he should not be near. "Yes, stay in the courtyard," she said, "and don't touch anything that breathes electricity." He looked to Vega, who gave a tiny shrug that tried to be magnanimous and landed as helpless. The boy withdrew. Grace pulled on gloves and moved through the office the way a slow tide decides furniture. Top drawer, receipts and pencils. Second drawer, stationery. Third drawer, a soft thunk of something not wood. She slid it open. A small lockbox that believed in privacy but not in theft. She levered it. The hasp gave, the lid lifted, and inside, a prepaid burner phone in matte black, a stack of memory cards in their plastic coffins, a folded page of numbers with first names and no surnames. She bagged the phone, slid a charge into it from a pocket battery, powered it under the eyes of a body cam, and waited for the low, guilty glow. No passcode. People who believe in anonymity often don't believe in inconvenience. She thumbed to the gallery, and the phone showed its grace notes. Photos named with dates, timestamps that lay down like tame dogs, geotags turned off with pious discipline. She opened one. The air thinned. Emily Cross at the morgue. Head supported by a block, chin strap removed, mouth at unnatural rest. The image showed the detail no one outside should have seen. The moment before a technician draws the mouth closed, when skin still remembers effort. Next, Peter Hale, beard combed, the lower lip bitten a fraction on the inside, the arc of enamel showing like moon. Next, Sophie Lane, left eye retaining that impudent squint, the kind that asked questions without waiting for permission. Confidential, controlled, chained to a room with bad air and stainless steel. "Explain," Grace said, keeping her eyes on the phone, letting the distance do the accusation. Vega didn't move from behind the desk. He had chosen his stillness. He wore it like a vest. "People send me things," he said. "When you become known for faces, the world thinks of you at its worst moments. Anonymous tipsters, if you like that story." "I didn't solicit." "Anonymous tipsters," Grace repeated, "who somehow obtained morgue stills and sent them to a man whose masks learned the same details that should never leave a drawer." His smile shifted one tooth. "Once the saints bled. We called it a miracle. Now pixels leak. We call that crime. But I didn't ask the saints to bleed." Grace let the line hang. She photographed the phone screen and bagged the lockbox as there is no coincidence. On the shelf above the desk, books on wax poured their quiet authority. Casting, polishing, aging. A folder lay just too far back, as if daylight were a kind of audit. She eased it out. Invoices. A purchase order to a laboratory supply in Miami for a compact resistance heater and PID controller with remote option, shipped to Vega House under Leo Brooks's name. A note. For gallery stabilization. "Your boy orders your heat," Grace said softly. "Under his name. Assistants assist," Vega said. "I sometimes sign for his groceries." Grace flattened the invoice on the blotter and took its picture. "We'll talk groceries later." She turned to the wall where the office met the corridor and noticed a subtle patch under the paint. Someone had opened the wall there within months. Fresh plaster has a way of forgetting to be shy. You have night visitors, she said, changing lanes. 2 recent nights in particular. Your back door logs show entries after midnight, but the timestamps drift like memory. Your reader is tampered. Vega raised both hands in a small theater of surrender. I play piano at night. People come. People go. Do they drum? She asked. He frowned. Drum? Your neighbor hears rhythms through the wall, Grace said. Low, controlled, like prayers with percussion. 2 murder nights, Mr. Vega. Drumming and murmurs. You want to tell me that's art too? His look was honest sad, a useful mask. Santeria lives everywhere, he said. On the street, in kitchens, in galleries when no one pays rent for a church. I light candles in memory. If drums answered, that was the city, not me. Grace didn't bother pointing out the candles were clean. She stepped into the hall where the security system hub sat in a metal cabinet with a manufacturer's sticker still scolding in Spanish and English. She clipped in a readout key and mirrored the logs for later, then crouched at the base where the data cable met the reader. Tiny nick marks where someone had lifted the cover, reset the RDC, and reseated the plug. She followed the corridor to the back door. The courtyard beyond was a square of weary light. The reader's face smiled its little green okay to anyone with a card and a reason. The strike plate showed a polish at one edge where entries were more careful than legitimate. She tested the door with a gentle insistence. It loved to open. Who has cards? She asked over her shoulder. Me, Vega said. Leo. Sometimes our patron when he wants to surprise a donor. Your patron. Charles Reed, he said, with the tone of a man saying a church's name. He gives. He expects to be moved. You move him at midnight, Grace said. With drums. He spread his hands. Some art prefers company. Some crimes do too, she said, and knocked on the wall between the office and gallery. Felt the duct behind it thrum faintly. The supplemental heater answering some unseen command like a dog taught only one trick. She turned back inside, crossed past the piano. The bench was still a geography of a missing thing. She slid a ruler under the lip and found a slight hollow worn smoother than wood deserves to be. Remote-sized. Your candor has bored a hole, she said to the bench. Vega watched her with a musician's patience. I don't know what that means. It means you're neat, she said. And neatness leaves the negative when the positive walks away. She ordered the house computer seized. It sat with its lid closed like a modest mouth. A tech arrived with an image kit and the shrug of a man asked to be invisible and precise. As he cloned the drive, Grace walked the hallway one more time with the small RF scanner that looked like a toy and had paid her mortgage twice. In the office, chatter from routers, a dead zone where the wall had more metal than plaster, a faint signature near the piano that came and went as if someone had taught it to be shy. She logged the frequency. Leo, she called, and when he appeared, she saw he'd washed his hands, as if cleanliness could erase the music of heat under the skin. You ever open the gallery alone at night? She asked. Only to dust, he said. Mr. Vega likes visitors to smell clean when they leave. Bayrum's a scent, she said. Not clean. He looked down. He says the light sits better when the wax wakes. Who else has a key? She asked again, less politely. He hesitated. Mr. Reed. For emergencies. Grace took it in. The patrician donor with a key for art that begs privacy. The assistant who orders precise heat for wax and calls it wakefulness. The keeper whose phones collect the dead. She turned to Vega. Explain the burner. I already did, he said mildly. People send me. She cut him off with a finger. Say the lie once. Don't grow it. Your phone will tell me who and from where. Your bank will tell me whether tips had tips. Your vents will tell me what you warmed and when. He leaned on the desk and let the charm slip enough to show the metal underneath. You know what this city does to artists who fall from favor? He asked. It forgets. But forgetting me won't bring those people back. Nothing will, Grace said. But we can stop the faces from learning the wrong lessons. A knock at the courtyard gate cut the air into triangles. A woman in the next building leaned on the iron with one arm and the authority of someone whose laundry beat truth into shape every morning. "You the detective?" she asked. Grace went to her. The woman's eyes held a wall's worth of history. "You hear drums," Grace said. "Tell me when." "Night 2 weeks ago," the woman said, counting her calendar with one finger. "The one with salt in the air with the big waves. Men's voices low. A bowl smell. And another night, the day the girl fell, that night too. The drums were not for dancing. For telling." "Telling what?" "That something was owed," the woman said and sniffed with dignity. "And I told my husband to stop listening." Grace thanked her and wrote it down not because she needed it but because she owed the woman the courtesy of ink. Back inside, she gathered the harvest. A burner phone with more ghosts bought, she would bet, with cash whose fingerprints still believed in soap. A door reader with a clock that cooperated with fiction. A bench with an absence where a remote once hid. An invoice under Leo's name for systems he could not afford. A neighbor's drums at hours when decency sleeps and commerce wakes. She stood in the middle of the office and let the outlines gather like a flock to a whistle. The mask changed because heat and hands and pressure and knowledge met in a room built for admiration. Knowledge came from a drawer meant to stay shut. Heat came from a device meant to be invisible. Hands came from a boy taught to be useful and a man who thought direction made him innocent. Pressure came from money. She closed the lockbox and handed it to the tech. "Bag and tag," she said, "and pull the last 30 days of the reader's event logs, even the zeros." As they left the office, Vega tapped the piano with one finger, a note that was accidentally honest. "You will dismantle something that keeps despair from rotting," he said. "I'll dismantle a theater that mistook suffering for stagecraft," she answered. "And then I'll see who bought tickets. Split the inquiry. Technical tampering to the lab and the electronics team. Ritual theater to the neighborhood, the patron, and the wallet that moves at midnight." By late afternoon, the sky over the Malecon had the dull shine of a knife left in dishwater. Grace returned to Vega House with a warrant addendum and a portable time server to bully the building's clocks into the same notion of truth. Leo opened the courtyard gate without being asked. He had that gray look people get when their versions of events start to shrink. "We're not going into the gallery," she said. "We're reading what breathes around it." He nodded. "Mr. Vega's at rehearsal." "For what?" "An empty room," Leo said, then blinked, as if the line had borrowed him. She synced the reader's RDC, set her own RF sniffer to log continuously, and stationed an officer in the mechanical closet with instructions to note any change in the PID output. Then she stood in the hallway between office and gallery and tried to hear intention in the ductwork. Havana's air pressed its salt against the shutters. The gallery door wore its red seal like a mouth stitched closed. 15 minutes, she told the officer in the closet. "Call out any spike, set point change, output duty over 50%, zone select." The minutes dripped. She was about to concede boredom when the radio on her shoulder gave a small, happy click that meant a graph somewhere had found a hill. "Navarro," the officer said, "we've got activity. Controller shows Zone C bumping to 58. Output 62% and climbing. PIDs in pulse mode." Grace looked at the sealed door. The reader beside it remained inert. No swipe, no open. The little screen still green with indifference. In the hall, the RF scanner flashed a new carrier. Not the router chatter, not the city's chorus, but a thin, decisive tone near the frequency she'd logged by the piano. "Hold," she said into the radio. "Do not open anything. Log the spike duration and the zone." She stepped into the office. The bench still remembered the remote that wasn't there. The piano's lid reflected a sliver of her face and offered no advice. She mapped the gallery in her head. Zone A near the saints, Zone B along the criminals, Zone C at the back wall by the shadows with the older cuts, where the neutral young male face sat in his quiet ignorance. The radio crackled. Output tapering. 45%, 30, set point steady at 5.8 for 4 minutes, then down. Total event 6 minutes, 43 seconds. Grace wrote the times. 18:12 start, 1819 end. No reader activity. No door. Warmed air to a specific diffuser and nowhere else. Whoever held the remote had warmed a mask without stepping into the room. Run the AC 1 minute, she ordered. Then kill the system and wait. When the air stilled again, she slit the seal, opened the gallery one hand width, and slid inside alone while the others kept their bodies out of the story. The room's cool had gained a slickness, the way a shell remembers the water even after you dry it. She crossed to the back wall. The neutral mask, a young male with features that had been sculpted to board anonymity, looked newly interested. Subtle but there. A tiny wet-looking pull at the corner of the mouth, a suggestion of a cut on the inner lip, and the eyelids had slackened, not closed, not drooped, but decided to give up a few millimeters of vigilance. She felt the recklessness that good detectives learn to fear in themselves. The urge to declare the trick solved when the magician has only reached for his scarf. She swabbed the nasolabial line, the lip, the edge of the eyelid where tool meets chance, and took a tape lift along the hairline where dust liked to land. Then she backed out, sealed the door, and let the cold do its honest work. By the time she reached the lab, evening had found the city and put a hand on its shoulder. Evan Ward received her new swabs the way a climber receives rope. He set to work without speech. The GC/MS hummed its night song. The SEM glowed. Same blend, he said after 10 minutes, eyes on the scope. Beeswax, paraffin with carnauba, same sterile whispers. Microdrag here too, fresh. Along the inner line of the lower lip. And the eyelid, see this? He switched the image. A field of wax topography where a smooth plane interrupted itself with slight parallel ridges. Ptosis isn't a sculptor's first thought, but a warmed eyelid edge will take a rounded tool like a memory takes suggestion. Grace waited for what she wanted more than confirmation. Something that didn't belong. Ward moved to the tape lift from the hairline, dialed the magnification down, and hunted the particles. Skin flakes that weren't human, too flat, too big, a thread of something blue that turned out to be lint, and then, caught at the edge of the adhesive, a small grain shaped like a tiny 5-pointed hand. Ward angled the light. The thing showed its structure, wax clinging to it like apology. Pollen, he said, not dust. Give me a minute. He photographed it, measured it, pulled down a reference atlas of Caribbean flora with pages that felt like they had been made from hospital sheets. Here, he said, and tapped a panel. Plumeria rubra, frangipani, pollen grains with distinctive colpi and sculpturing. See the ridging? It's common on trees along cemetery walks. People plant them for shade and perfume. There's a path in Cologne where they drop enough flowers to tile a dream. Frangipani, Grace said. She pictured the cemetery. Long corridors of marble, angel knees blackened by weather, bronze letters unlearning names. In a sealed gallery. The grains not crushed, Ward added. Fresh. Landed. Then pressed slightly into the wax. She wrote, trace pollen, plumeria, frangipani, hairline of mask, the kind that dusts a shirt sleeve if you brush a tree on a narrow path, the kind a person brings on themselves. You sure? She asked, not because she doubted, but because doctrine demanded it. I'll bring in a palynologist if you want a second sermon, Ward said, but I'd swear a small oath. Grace put her phone down to keep from calling the cemetery right then. Instead, she looked at the timeline in her notes. 1812 duct spike, Zone C, 1819 taper. At 1940, her phone buzzed with a note from dispatch, the kind that starts cold and ends colder. Homicide, male, late 20s, behind a club off Neptuno. Barback, name believed to be Noah Grant. Laceration to inner lower lip. Eyelids described as lazy by EMT. Possible intoxication. Pupils small. Ward watched her face and said nothing. She read it aloud anyway, because speaking a fact is a way to make it survive the hour. Noah Grant. Lip cut. Ptosis. Ward exhaled. You're kidding me. No, she said. She called the responding officer, got the scene's cross street, and was in her car before Ward had put the lid back on the sample tray. Havana flowed around her like a rumor. The club's alley was a chute for heat, a narrow cut between buildings where dumpsters arranged to smell, and flies held jurisdiction. Noah's body lay on a black bag, not yet zipped. He had the stillness of someone in between being seen and being counted. The medical examiner met her halfway. He dropped behind the kitchen door, the me said. Some kind of neuroactive. Breathing shallow, pulse rapid. Then the world fell through the floor. We'll know when we tear him apart. But his eyelids, see? Ptosis, not rigor. And the lower lip. There's a small cut inside, probably from biting as he went. Grace crouched to see the mouth at the angle the mask had shown her. The cut was the width of impatience. A fine dark dot at the lip's edge looked like something that could be ink, could be oil, could be accident. She swabbed it because could be is a luxury evidence can't afford. Who found him? She asked. Cook, the officer said. Says Mr. Vega had been in the kitchen earlier, asking about sourcing special fish for a donor event. Wants to do a demonstration, says he has a recipe. Left before shift, witnesses say. Grace wrote the name Noah Grant in block letters, as if the difference between a man and a case were typographical. She called the unit watching Vega House. Status at 1812? She asked. The officer on duty sounded pleased to be consulted. No entries. No door. Your system's reader shows no love. She looked at the alley's slice of sky. Somewhere a plumeria tree hung its perfume over a path of the dead. Somewhere in a sealed room a neutral face had softened into a prophecy. Back at the lab, Ward had already begun a tox screen on a residue from Noah's lip swab under a quick protocol. Alkaloid signatures, he said, squinting at the early peaks. Could be tetrodotoxin if the world wants to be neat. We'll confirm. Grace set the day's facts in 2 columns the way you set chess pieces where everyone can judge the geometry. At 1812, the duct heater spiked to 58 Celsius on Zone C, no door entry, RF activity at the piano's frequency. At 19:30, Noah Grant collapsed behind a club. Inner lower lip cut. Eyelid ptosis consistent with neurotoxin. On the changed mask, fresh microdrag along the lip, slackened lids, and a pollen grain from frangipani typical of a cemetery path along which Vega had no reason to walk unless he enjoyed company with angels. She ran her finger under the words until they burned. A mask had changed before the death it foretold, and either she was dealing with coincidence so theatrical it begged to be arrested, or she was watching a schedule, an announcement in wax, a preface to murder. She called the cemetery warden at Cologne and asked the favor only law and shared skepticism could justify. Do your plumeria drop heavy today? She asked. Always by the east colonnade, he said. The gardeners work with brooms and still lose. Send me a sweep of fresh fall and a photo of the path if you can, she said. And if you've seen Mr. Vega in the last week, pretend I didn't ask and tell me anyway. The warden laughed the laugh of a man who had buried much and thus earned the right to be unafraid. He likes the angels, he said. Walks with tourists sometimes. Pretends not to read the names. Grace hung up and let the exhaustion come up from the floor. The horror in this case wasn't ghosts. It was choreography. Someone warmed a face, shaped fear onto it, then made the world deliver the same expression to a living person within hours. The room did not predict. It advertised. Lock in the heating event at 1812. Map Zone C to the neutral mask. Track Noah's last movements. Canvass the cemetery path for frangipani transfer. And start writing the question in permanent ink. Who had access to both the remote and the dead? Morning pushed Havana's heat through the blinds like a hand that didn't know its strength. Grace went back to Vega House with sleeves rolled and questions sharpened. Leo Brooks was waiting in the courtyard, his posture a kind of plea, the way stray dogs look at gates. He had washed his hair and not quite gotten all the water out. Clean as strategy, not as habit. We're going to look at everything you call maintenance, she said. And then we're going to look at your hands. He glanced at them as if he'd forgotten they were on him. I polish, he said. That's all. In my experience, all is a room with 3 doors, Grace said, and let him lead her to the supply closet. The closet was a thin cathedral to the god of small changes. Shelves of cloths folded into obedience. Glass bottles labeled in a neat blockhand. Bay rum, mineral spirits, lemon oil, lanolin cream, a shoebox of nozzles and tips, a second box labeled wands that pretended to be light. Grace set the second box on the floor and opened it. Inside, wrapped in brown paper and patience, 2 mini heat wands with narrow ceramic tips, a third with a flattened paddle for warming broader planes, a digital power supply with thumbwheel temperature control, and a coil of silicone-insulated wire the color of old plums. "Correction tools," she said, more to the room than to Leo. "Dental spatulas?" He pointed to a roll of cloth tied with string. She unrolled it. Shiny implements lay like polite teeth. Small spooners, leaf-shaped micro-paddles, a double-ended burnisher with one end polished mirror bright. She lifted one, felt its weight, and set it down where fingerprints would be least offended. "Where'd you get them?" she asked. Mr. Vega sent me links," Leo said. "Sometimes he ordered. Sometimes he had me order." "Under your name," she said. He found a ledger with the earnestness of someone hoping paper would take the blame. She paged through the neat entries and found the familiar receipts. A lab supply in Miami for a PID controller and compact resistance heater. A dental tool retailer. A hobbyist electronics shop with a photo of a man soldering on its header. All shipped care of Leo Brooks to Vega House. "You ever think why everything precise goes through you?" she asked. "I'm cheaper to break," he said, almost rueful. "If it's wrong, it's my fault." Grace looked at him over the ledger. "Is it?" He didn't answer. She set the ledger aside and took out her small UV light again. "Hands," she said. He extended them. Under UV, the crescent reddening she'd clocked yesterday had matured to a faint glaze. The web between his thumb and forefinger had the sheen of skin that had kissed heat without consent. The pad of his left index finger showed a smooth oval where a tool shaft might rest when you forget your gloves. "You were in the wax within the last 2 days," she said. "No one gets those without touching warmth." "Mr. Vega said to correct sagging," he said. Faces slump. "The saints and the murderers. Everyone's tired." "Describe correct," Grace said. "Just," he mimed a tiny stroke in the air. "Quick, precise. Warm the crease. Ease the line. Set the mouth the way it was meant to be." "The way it was meant to be," Grace repeated, and walked past him to a narrower door at the back of the closet, one that didn't want to be noticed. She opened it with a hinge sound like a swallowed cough. The room beyond was small enough to be honest. A bench, a clamp lamp with a shade ringed by baked dust, a corkboard with printouts of faces in grid overlays, morgue stills reduced to shapes and ratios, distances between mouth corners, angles of eyelid droop, the negative space under a bitten lip charted like a harbor. On the bench, half-casts, not whole heads, just mouths, noses, eye corners, the geometry of expression severed from the rest like learning a word without caring for the sentence. She picked one up. The half-mouth was Emily's, unmistakable as a borrowed scar. You could see the fresh drag on the nasolabial line where a warm spatula had taught the wax to remember fear. On another cast, a lower lip with the inner arc planed to that crescent enamel reveal. The Peter practice, exact and patient. A third showed an eyelid softened and shifted. The Sophie squint rehearsed to an angle a ruler would respect. Leo watched her touch them with gloved fingers that didn't touch. "Mr. Vega says you don't work on the faces themselves until you can do it blind on the practice," he said, voice small. "He says the public deserves competence." "Competence at what?" Grace asked. "Imitating the dead?" "At honoring them," Leo said, but it broke halfway out of his mouth and fell. "Show me how you hold the wand," she said. He reached for one of the heat tools without thinking and caught himself, looking at her for permission. She nodded. He plugged it into the power supply and set the dial the way his hands remembered, not the way a manual would advise. He held the shaft like a pen, braced with his index against the ceramic neck, and worked the air an inch above the half-cast, as if warming memory before contact. Then he set the metal spatula to the warmed wax and drew a line along the crease with the attention of a person taught that the difference between art and error is pressure. Grace could almost hear it, the tiny hiss of wax admitting defeat. She raised a hand. "Enough!" He let the wand cool. His fingers didn't tremble. It was not his first time making a mouth tell a story it hadn't chosen. "Who told you to match the morgue photos?" she asked quietly. He opened his mouth and closed it again. "He showed me the overlays," he said finally. "He said the city wanted to see itself. He said grief needs a mirror. He said a lot of things," Grace said. "You ever think he meant money when he said city?" Leo studied a line on the floor with devotion. "There are donors," he admitted. "They come late. They like to be moved." "And Mr. Reed?" Grace asked. "Does he like to be moved?" Leo winced at the name like a boy flinches at a belt taken down from a hook. "He pays. He brings people. He says nothing should be wasted, not money, not fear." Grace bit back the taste in her mouth and went back to the corkboard. One printout bore a header from a photo editor. Grid opacity at 40%. Angle notes. A file name that hummed with the shape of Sophie Lane's name even though the vowels had been replaced. A USB thumb drive on the bench waited like a tiny coffin. She bagged it. "When did you last go to the Botanical Santeria Supply?" she asked, almost conversational. Leo startled. I don't." "Receipt," she said, and he looked like a boy who had hidden the wrong sin. He pulled a stapled bundle from a stack of tidy envelopes and handed it over. Grace read the inventory. Ritual candles, white and red. A bottle of anointed oil, Hierba Buena. A second, Dominio. A third, Santo Silence. A packet of powdered charcoal. A roll of cotton wick. Purchase date: the day before Peter Hale died. "Who paid?" she asked, knowing but wanting him to say it. "Mr. Vega," Leo said. "He likes the room to feel." The word died on him. "He says atmosphere teaches respect." Grace pictured the clean candle cups in the gallery, their wicks virginal. "You lit nothing," she said. "He likes the thought of flame," Leo said, almost apologizing for physics. "It's enough for him most nights." She put the receipt in an evidence envelope with the same care you give a baby who has learned an unkind word. "Leo," she said, and let the quiet stretch until he had to fill it. "Why you?" He understood. "Because my hands don't shake," he said. "Because I don't argue when the angle's wrong and he corrects me. Because I owe rent and this is not heavy lifting." He looked at the practice casts. "And because when I press a line just right the wax listens. Feels like control. And when Mr. Vega says, 'Wake the wax,' does he say whose face you're waking it into?" "He shows me the overlay," Leo said. "He doesn't say the name. Not always." "But you knew," Grace said. He took too long to answer. "Sometimes you can tell," he whispered. "A crooked tooth. A scar. The city is small when you stand in the right room." She let the failure of that sentence sit between them like a third person. Then she walked him back to the courtyard, past the piano that loved to lie. As they passed, she slid her fingers under the bench again and this time touched adhesive that had given up its secret earlier, leaving only tack and the shape of absence. She imagined the remote living under there, a shy god pressed into service. On for Zone C, 5 minutes of prayer, off. Heat rendered as intention without location. Outside, the day had become a glare. Grace took a last look at Leo's hands in the mean light. They were not cruel hands. They were careful hands being used. "Here's what I see," she said, not unkindly. "Mr. Vega builds the theater. He procures the images of the dead. He buys the heat and the wand and the excuse of candles. He summons donors and a patron who likes to hear himself move. You," she nodded at his hands, "provide the gestures. If he's the idea, you're the execution. That makes you necessary. It does not make you safe." He swallowed. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet," she said. "But you are under gravity. It's stronger than you think." She signed for the seizure of the wands, the spatulas, the ledger, the thumb drive, the practice casts, and the Santeria receipt. As the techs carried the boxes out, Leo stood in the doorway with the look of a person who has just discovered the stage is load-bearing and will not move for love. On the street, Grace leaned against her car and wrote the part she hated writing most. The truth without the reason. Vega curates the theater. Leo supplies the hands, The masks do not change by themselves. They are taught. The why still floats, not ready to be netted. Money, notoriety, ritual debt, or the narcotic of making life answer to technique. Vega's purchases and direction, Leo's tooling and burns, practice casts as rehearsal, Santeria receipt as stage dressing. The mechanics are clear. The motive isn't. Grace drew a line down the center of a whiteboard and wrote names on one side, rooms on the other. The rooms were literal gallery, office, club kitchen, archive, and metaphorical, where people become the versions of themselves that get them killed. She started with Emily Cross. Emily had been all elbows and laughter in the photos her friends gave the police. All angles and teeth in the hotel camera the night she argued with a man outside a red door that led to a stairwell of illegal views. Grace watched the footage twice, then a third time, and only then did she see how Emily's temper was a trapeze, how she enjoyed the airtime of nearly falling. At the hotel bar, the manager poured out the story gratefully. She said the private viewing wasn't private, he told Grace. She said she paid and Vega let 2 donors in anyway. She came back here and told the whole bar Havana was a set and the extras were too loud. And Vega? Grace asked. He followed to apologize, the manager said, and shrugged the way men shrug when charm works on them. He was persuasive. Grace pulled the card logs from the gallery's back door for that night and found the drift like infection. Times that ached to match the apology. She matched them to cell site hits from Vega's phone cluster and drew another line between name and room. Emily met Vega on Tuesday. Emily died Wednesday. The mask that had been a calm woman became a panic mouth within hours of their argument. Peter Hale was easier to taxonomize. Invoices, emails, a quarrel in messages that read like overdue breath. He had a cold room and a temper that thawed around no one. Peter supplied ice to restaurants and galleries who wanted their salmon to sweat beautifully under halogens. Vega paid late and dramatized it. We pulled the cube train for him twice, Peter's brother said, standing in a warehouse where air bit. He wanted ice for transport of delicate work and didn't want to pay the rush. When we cut him off, he shows up with a donor, smooth as olive oil, says, "Art will make us all right." He leaves still owing 3 deliveries. 2 days after the last argument, Peter died behind his own shop under a shelf that had offered to fall and then decided to push instead. Beard combings at autopsy had yielded microwax flakes the color of denial. Grace had labs report now. Those flakes matched the gallery blend with a certainty a jury could stand on. On the wall, she drew a second line. Peter hauled ice for Vega on Friday. Peter's mask learned a bitten lip on Saturday. Peter himself hit the concrete before dawn Sunday. Lower lip cut inside as if he had tried to swallow a warning. Sophie Lane gave Grace the ache only clever interns give. The city archives smelled like paper that had learned to be a desert. Sophie's workstation held a neatness that suggested the rest of her life would also have been a system. Grace pulled the last month of her scan file logs and found Vega House like a shadow. Collections of ethnographic portraiture, complaints about ethical display, and a draft memo to her supervisor titled, "In the straightforward rage of a careful person, concerns regarding Vega collection." Her supervisor, a woman with a good jaw and a better sense of when to stop talking, passed over the memo and looked at Grace like one professional to another. She liked rules because they made things possible, the supervisor said, and she liked to prod sleep. She emailed Mr. Vega for provenance on 3 masks he could not provide. He invited her to see them in person. She declined. Sophie died 2 days later. Her fall down a stairwell calculated enough to look like impatience. Lanolin on her collar told the truer story. Someone had placed a hand near her throat earlier that evening, a hand wearing the same mix that warmed wax. The masks left I squinted in the gallery within a day of her memo. On the whiteboard, Grace wrote Sophie, archive, email/provenance, fall, and drew a line so straight it felt like disrespect. Noah Grant completed the X. The club off Neptuno wore sound like armor. The manager needed his alibi to be believed and thus wasn't helpful. Grace stood behind the bar and watched footage until the footage watched her back. There was Vega in the corner, a glass sweating in his hand. performing sincerity for a table with the ease of a man who has seen every ear. Later, the camera over the kitchen caught him at the back door talking to a cook with the apron pride of a man above his station. They spoke about fish, about an event, about quantities. Later still, Noah texted someone from the alley, "Keep receipts shut or they'll make the gallery sing." The number he texted was a throwaway, belonged to a stack of cards Charles Reed paid for in cash. Noah died after the kitchen talk, ptosis, lip cut. The neutral mask's eyelids drooped 3 hours prior. Grace took her pen and underlined the pattern until the paper threatened to bleed. Emily argued with Vega about a refund from a private viewing. Peter quarreled over unpaid deliveries that kept Vega's masks cold between stages. Sophie flagged the collection's provenance in a memo and emailed Vega questions he couldn't answer if anonymous tipsters aren't recognized by law. Noah bartended where Vega hunted donations and patrons. He had texts warning him to keep receipts shut. Plural receipts, money and proof. Every name crossed Vega within 7 days of death. Each mask altered within a day of the encounter. The gallery had become a confessional with Heat as a priest. "Now the patron," Grace said to the empty air, and wrote Reed under rooms. She pulled bank statements by warrant and looked at the money the way cartographers look at rivers. Reed's transfers to Vega wore euphemism: expansion support, evening salon, restoration. To Leo, after-hours maintenance. The amounts were not obscene, but they were persistent, like a tide that looks harmless until you add time. Camera hits placed Reed's car near Vega House on 2 of the murder nights. Belts of rain on the windshield caught in a streetlight like slashes of proof. Casino footage patched his alibi with angles not quite enough to cover a man who could afford a gap. Grace, who had learned to respect small artifacts, went back to the burner phone. The memory cards in their plastic coffins held what she expected and feared. Morgue stills, retouched to tidy away autopsy tape and chin props. The overlays Leo had admitted to using, grids that turned grief into geometry. File metadata hummed a quiet hymn to origin. Timestamps created on Vega's laptop, not on the burner. Imports from a directory whose path held the shape of a name in the coroner's office that wasn't the coroner's. She added a new task to her list. Pull the porter's phone records, the one who smoked behind the loading dock and liked to be useful for people who explained his dignity to him. On a hunch, she asked the records unit for the HVAC log's raw stream rather than the neat summaries. In the noise was the confession. Short RF bursts precisely before the temperature rises, frequencies that matched the piano bench signature. The duct heated for the masks corresponding to the encounters. A after Emily, B after Peter, B again for Sophie's eye, C for Noah's blank face that became prophecy, as if someone were both practicing and publishing. She made the rounds again, slower and meaner. Back at the hotel, the bartender who liked Emily's laugh remembered Vega telling her, "You have to understand I'm showing people something true." At the ice warehouse, a driver who didn't like rich men said, "Your man came with a patron who filmed the way he talked." At the archives, a guard remembered Leo at the service entrance carrying a box labeled donor plaques, asking for Sophie by first name. At the club, the cook confessed that Vega had brought him a printout once. Japanese text, Spanish notes, about preparing fugu and removing poison with care and art. The cook had hung it on the walk-in door like a joke. Grace photographed it. She didn't laugh. When night fell like a curtain, she stood in her apartment with the city pressed against her windows and drew the web again on the cheap whiteboard she kept for the versions of cases she didn't want anyone else to see. Name to room, room to mask, mask to method. A private viewing become a public argument, become a strangled mouth. An unpaid invoice become a bitten lip, become a stand used as a mace. A memo become a squint, become a stairwell. A warning text become a sleepy eyelid, become a fishbone ground down to alkaloid. And through them all, bay rum and lanolin, the smell of a barber giving a last good groom to a face that won't sweat anymore. She looked at the center where all lines crossed. It wasn't a mask. It wasn't a room. It was a man who liked to be called a curator when author would have been closer to the truth. And next to him, in parentheses, the hands. Pull the physical link tight. Trace the morgue imagery's path from drawer to overlay. Map the HVAC zones to specific pedestals with photographic proof. and find the thing that moves between dead skin and wax, an object or a fingerprint that says, "The changes here were done by this person's touch at this hour." The second key on Vega's ring was new metal pretending to be old. Grace had seen it in his hand and in his pocket and in the small theater he did when he needed time, palming, twirling, losing it and finding it again like a coin. She asked for it just after noon, when men who liked performances expected lunch to be their audience. He gave it up the way a magician gives up a scarf, with flourish and reluctance. "Mechanical gallery office," he said. "And that one storage." "Cold storage?" Grace asked. He smiled. "Only in temperament." The storage room lived behind a door at the end of a narrow service corridor where the plaster remembered suitcases from other centuries. The key turned and stuck halfway, then surrendered with a sulky click. The air that came out had a graphite hush to it. Grace snapped on the overhead, a single bulb that drew a thin circle of truth, and looked at a small world arranged by a mind that required rehearsal. Shelving ran waist to shoulder height. On the top shelf, rectangular silicone trays dusted with something black and fine. On the middle, small plaster negatives nested like molars. On the low shelf, a shoebox that rattled and a portable labeler that had learned only one vocabulary. A folding table sat in the center with a blotter of butcher paper and a metal rule, its edge dinged from nervous precision. The table's surface had ghosts, arcs and ovals traced in a soft charcoal that had been wiped but never fully forgiven. Grace lifted one of the silicone pieces with 2 fingers the way you lift a sleeping cat, respectful, aware of claws. The silicone had a tacky give, and its surface showed the negative of a mouth, the depth of a cupid's bow, the trench of a philtrum, the shallow valley where a lower lip meets a chin in a person who clenches. Pressed into the silicone, clinging where it had been dusted with powdered charcoal to reveal tool chatter, were the micro-topographies of labor. Fine parallel ridges from a rounded spatula, a hiccup where a hand had paused and corrected, a hairline notch that replayed itself on the mask in the gallery like a stutter. She held it under the bulb and watched the ridges shine with a dull honesty. At one corner, a stray inclusion caught the light, a filament too bright to be wax, too stubborn to be dust. Tweezers, lift, bag. Blue polyester, cut at an angle as if torn, not snipped. One side glossy with broken filaments like a cheap starburst. Uniform thread, the kind that loves to snag. She set the silicone cast down and picked up another. An eye corner this time, the Sophie practice. Charcoal made the slope of the lid red like sound. A third, Peter's bitten lip rehearsed to the precise fraction that would show enamel, not drool. The shoebox rattled again when she moved, as if conscience had bones. She opened it. Powdered charcoal in a sachet, cotton swabs, small bulbs with rubber necks for puffs of dust, and a roll of tape with its own history. Edges darkened by fingers that ignored gloves when hurry one. A USB stick lay near the labeler, not hidden so much as resigned. Grace bagged it without ceremony. The labeler kissed out a white ribbon that said Practice 3B. Emily NL line, as if paperwork could make a line less like a wound. On the way out, she paused at the door jamb. Fresh paint, but underneath, a nick shaped like the corner of something leaned in a hurry. She measured the height, exactly the level of a man in a rush carrying a box of negatives, bumping the world with his habit. Back in the office, she set the USB to clone under a text watch and went to the piano bench with a real purpose. She lay flat on the floor where rich men's dust hadn't considered and looked up under the bench lip. Adhesive residue filmed the wood in a rectangle precise enough to make a carpenter proud. She took a dental mirror from her kit and angled it, caught a glint where glue had failed farther back. A strip of gaffer tape folded into itself tugged free with the slow rip that only secrets make. Tucked inside, small, black, and smug, sat an RF remote like a car fob that had gone to music school. "Hello," Grace said to it, which is what you say to an object that has been waiting to contradict a person. She bagged the remote and checked the scuffed plastic with her loupe. Fine abrasions on the up button, a polished spot on the back toggle, the tiny scoring where a thumbnail had worried a seam. She dusted with magnetic powder that climbed into detail on the plastic like iron filings standing up to someone you'd like to believe. Prints were partial and overlapped, but one, an oblique swipe across the lower diagonal, held a distinctive topography. A scar crossing a ridge in a way dermatoglyphics textbooks love. She fixed it with lifting film and slid it into a card. Then she took photos of Vega's hands as he signed the property receipt. The left thumb bore an old burn that had taught the ridge to interrupt its sentence. If the day decided to please her, the print and the thumb would be cousins. "You're very thorough," Vega said, his voice calibrated for appreciation. "I'm very curious," she said, "and you've given me a lot to be curious about." He looked at the remote as if it had betrayed him by existing. "Everyone uses RF, even air conditioners. I prefer Windows," Grace said, and left before Charm could make a closing argument. At the lab, Evan Ward had already built a special chair for the silicone negatives, 2 clamps covered in nitrile, a diffuse lamp, and a camera rig so steady it made earthquakes apologize. He had the fiber under a scope. "Polyester," he said, not looking up. "Blue, round cross-section, trilobal glare. This isn't a suit. This is uniform fabric." He turned to a chart of textile standards. "Club staff wear poly because it forgives sins. If you find a match to a garment, it'll be cheap and stubborn." Grace wrote Noah's club uniform beside fiber and underlined it. "We have his locker at the station," she said. "Bag the whole shirt." Ward moved to the USB with the gravity of a man starting a confession. The directory structure popped up on a screen like a family tree that forgot to lie. Folders named Practice Mouths, Practice Eyes, Overlays. Inside overlays, files with naming schemes that pretended to anonymity and failed. 2025-09-12 overlay grid PSD. 2025-09-17 page _ overlay.ai. 2025-09-22 _SL left I overlay.tiff. Metadata hummed an unambiguous melody. Created on Vega House /Martin. Edited in Photoshop and Illustrator. Export pipelines resolved to a user directory that spelled his surname twice, habit, vanity, or the accident of a man who likes seeing his own letters. Ward clicked one open. A semi-transparent grid nested over Emily's morgue still. Alignment marks at mouth corners. Notes in a neat hand. NL line. Plus 2.3 degrees. Crisp at apex. Tooth reveal. Avoid gloss. Another overlay bore the Peter correction. Bite. Enamel crescent point 12 in. Lower lip tension. Simulate tremor. Sophie's had eye measurements like a surveyor's notes. Ptosis angle, 11 degrees. Lash shadow. Soft, do not shine. Grace felt the small, clean fury she saved for men who called theft curation. "Save those," she said. "Clone the drive. Right protect the stick. Do the thing you do where no one can say chain of custody broke because the computer got lonely." Ward nodded, already there. "And your heater logs?" She handed over the mechanical closet download and the RF event sniffer record. He overlaid them with a bar charmer's deafness. RF pulses preceding PID duty cycle spikes, 10 times in 3 weeks, each tied to a zone that mapped neatly to pedestals in the gallery. Zone labels matched Grace's photos. A for the Saint Wall where Emily's smile had failed. B for the criminals where Peter's lip learned to fear itself. B again for Sophie's practice squint by the pillar. C for the neutral young man who had recently become the rehearsal for Noah's fall. The lag between RF and heat read like intent. 6 seconds, 5, 7, a human thumb pressing buttons, waiting for confirmation, pressing again. "Someone warmed faces from outside the room," Ward said. "Someone who likes a piano bench." Grace pulled the lifted print from her case and slid it next to a live scan of Vega's left thumb the booking officer had taken when he signed for seized property. The scar cut across ridge 5 at a consistent angle. She called the latent unit for a formal comparison because doctrine was a jealous god. But Ward, who had learned to speak in probabilities and keep the conclusions out of his eyebrows, said, "If that's not his thumb, it's his thumb's twin." "Scar as a biomarker," Grace said softly. "Vanity always leaves a detail." The textile unit got back to them before lunch had a chance to be a rumor. Noah's Club issued uniforms made of a poly blend with a specific thread that fluoresced under blue light like a cheap promise. The fiber from the silicone negative matched the spectral response curve within tolerances that made statisticians comfortable. In Noah's locker, the shoulder of his shirt had a small snag with filaments broken at a length that loved to live under the edge of a silicone tray if a person leaned to blow charcoal dust and misjudged distance. Grace let the geometry of it settle. In a room of practice, a negative for Sophie's, I had accepted a stray thread from Noah's uniform because someone hovered too close while rehearsing Fear. The same hands adjusted a PID controller's effect from a remote hidden under a piano bench where donors listened to a man sell honesty as a style. A USB held overlays that turned morgue faces into heat instructions. She wrote the paragraph she would later love the prosecutor to read aloud. In a locked cabinet were silicone negatives, dusted with powdered charcoal to reveal tool marks. One negative captured Sophie Lane's asymmetrical squint. Embedded within, a blue polyester fiber consistent with Noah Grant's club uniform. A USB recovered from the same room contained retouched autopsy photographs with grid overlays created on Martin Vega's laptop. HVAC controller logs show manual overrides via RF. A remote was recovered taped beneath the piano bench. Latent print on remote bears a scarred ridge consistent with Vega's left thumb. ***. She could feel the case harden under her hands like wax after touch. The gallery's miracle had begun to speak a language judges understand. Transfer, intent, control, connection. It was no longer theater only. It was choreography with receipts. Vega, brought to the lab for a polite viewing of his own habits, affected hurt. "You make it sound ugly," he said, studying the silicone mouths like an uncle at a baptism who dislikes the baby. "I restore what decay takes. Faces collapse. I lend them back their meaning." "You lend them a different meaning," Grace said. "One you bought with a porter's rent and a boy's hands." He leaned close to the overlay of Emily's mouth, and that was when she saw it. The small twitch at the corner of his lip when the grid lined up with the photograph, the little satisfaction of a man whose mirror agrees with him. Not pride in murder, that would have been too easy, but pride in craft. She filed it with the scar and the bench and the remote and the smell of bay rum that lived in his hair like a halo that had made a bad bet. On her way out, she stopped in the corridor by the mechanical closet and pressed her palm to the door, feeling the hum through wood, the heater asleep, the PID awaiting its note. She thought of the neighbor's drums and the words she'd used to herself on the first day. If wax moved, something moved it. Heat, hands, or pressure. She had all three now bound to names. Package the cabinet's contents. Push the latent match through formal comparison. Tie the fiber to Noah's shirt with lab certainties. Write the overlay chain to Vega's machine, and put the RF remote under the piano in a frame that even a patron can see. By the time the autopsy lights came up on Emily Cross, Grace had memorized the room's particular quiet. The clink of instruments that never quite turn into music. The wet hush of a body that isn't a person anymore. The medical examiner, Dr. Marquez, narrated like a teacher who respects attention. "Manual strangulation," she said, her voice calm enough to hold a blade. "No hyoid fracture. Fingernail crescent abrasions at lateral neck. Petechiae conjunctival. Under the right thumbnail, trace of a volatile that wasn't hers." She held up the clear swab tube. "Bay rum per your lab's preliminary. And the lanolin you like." "Not mine," Grace said, "because habits talk when the dead don't. But it lives in a room I know." They moved down the body, the choreography gentle enough to shame theater. The pattern of fingertip pressure along the strap muscles told a right-handed grip, height close, familiar. This wasn't a stranger's smash and flee. It was a close argument that decided to be permanent. "Whoever did this takes care of faces," Marcus said, almost to herself, tracing under the jaw. "No rug burns, no grill from cement. He knows where skin gives for photographs." Grace thought of Vega's rehearsals and felt a click that wasn't satisfaction. Not yet. Peter Hale set his own table in the cold room. He'd been found sprawled behind a shelf whose bolts wanted to retire. The lividity put him where witnesses claimed. The contusions told a different story. Marquez lifted a bagged, heavy object from evidence. A bronze mask stand, base broad and proud, its stem ending in a cradle that remembered faces. "Blood consistent with the victim," she said. Impact geometry sloppy but decisive. Beard combings. She pointed to a tray where crumbs of wax and a hair or two lay like abandoned thoughts. Your lab says carnauba and paraffin. I agree with anyone who brings me good data. Grace leaned closer. Embedded in one crease of the bronze base, dark under the curve, a flake had hidden like a dried tear. She took a photo through the evidence sleeve. You swing with what you love, she said. Or what is nearest, Marcus countered. Men grab the closest dependable object and make it a decision. Sophie Lane waited third, her face blank, her left eye still squinting as if it hadn't gotten the memo. The neck showed no ligature, the wrists no defensive scrapes, the back no ladder of trauma. Pushed, Marcus said. From the landing. Skull fracture on right parietal. But before that, lanolin smear at collar point left side. Thumbprint shape with edge contamination. Like someone's hand remembered working something greasy and forgot to wash. The smear sat like a small signature no one admits to knowing. Grace could feel its texture without touching. The tack of hand cream, the whisper of bay rum laid over it like cologne on a day suspect. And then Noah Grant, poor and still new to the city's bulletin board. The labs had been kind to the dead by being quick. Ward's tox confirmed tetrodotoxin, pufferfish's favorite rumor, at a level that told a story of measure, not luck. The bite marks in the lip weren't panic. They were the body's last argument with its own disappearing breath. Where does a gallery boy get tetro? Marquez asked, and Grace supplied the footnote from the club kitchen. The printout on fugu with Spanish notes and Vega's handwriting in the margins where he corrected translation with elegance. The ways of dying did not match. The residues did. Every body wore a film of the gallery like a forgotten word. Bay rum and lanolin, micro-wax confetti, the touch evidence of a room that pretended to be sacred. Back at Vega House, Grace walked the gallery like a crime scene that had not yet learned its lines. She stood before Emily's mask and watched how fear had been templated into a commodity. She stood by Peter's lip and thought of gravity made useful. She stood next to Sophie's eye and felt the pressure of a thumb that had greeted lanolin earlier that night. She looked at the neutral face that had softened, wrote Noah on her mental labeler, and let anger edit itself into focus. "Mr. Vega," she said when he appeared in the doorway like a well-practiced thought. "Let's talk methods." "Art is method," he said, as if English had forgotten other uses for the word. "Emily strangled," Grace said, not waiting for his permission to inventory. "Her right thumbnail carries your room on it. Peter hit with your stand, wax crumbs in his beard, your stand's base wearing a flake like a souvenir." Sophie pushed. Her collar remembers a hand that doesn't wash after making wax obey. Noah died by a measured poison while your enthusiasm for exotic fish increased, and your neutral mask rehearsed his last look. Vega's gaze traveled over his collection, as if deciding which face could stand the burden of this conversation. "Faces change," he said mildly. "Yours has. You grow certain when you should be wondering." "I wonder plenty," Grace said. "I wonder why methods shift when your motive doesn't. Strangulation is intimacy. Blunt force is theater. A push is a coward's shove in an empty stairwell. Tetrodotoxin is a craftsman's murder. You dose, you watch, you time the fall. The through line isn't the killing. It's the staging. And staging is your genius." He smiled without teeth. "If you thought me a killer, you'd have taken me already." "I think you an author," she said. "And authors decide verbs." She left him with the piano and the bench that missed its friend and went to find Leo in the corridor that always smelled like a waiting room. He was rubbing his thumb along the seam of his palm as if trying to erase a map only he could see. "You ever put your hands on someone's throat?" she asked, gentle the way you are before a door you hope will open but know might slam. His eyes flared, then lowered. "No. You ever lift a stand and make a decision with it?" He shook his head. "I carry them. I don't throw." "You ever brush a collar because someone was falling and you thought you could make time obey?" He looked at the floor's pattern. "I touched Sophie's shoulder once," he said. "At the archive. I went to ask about plaques. She said no. I reached without thinking. She moved like a door closing. That's all." And Noah? Grace asked. You know fish. I know knives, he said. Not fish. Grace left him, not satisfied, not done. She visited Charles Reed instead, whose apartment faced the sea like money pretends to be honest. Reed opened his door in shirt sleeves that cost more than heat should, and gestured at the decanter as if bourbon explained culture. You've been in the gallery on nights when masks learned new tricks, she said. You've filmed a man who warmed faces with a remote under a piano. You've paid a boy to stay late and call it maintenance. Reed judged her with a smile designed in a boardroom. You're theatrical, he said. You should work for Martin. Tell me about Noah, she said. Your number on his phone, prepaid cards you buy by the handful. Keep receipts shut or they'll make the gallery sing. What song is that? Reed swirled the glass so the light had something to do. I commission experiences, he said. Martin makes the faces speak. People like to be moved. It makes giving easier. Do you commission deaths? Grace asked. He laughed with the kind of disbelief money buys. Please, I haven't the Constitution. I do, however, understand that a gallery needs relevance. Fear is relevance. Art lives in the nerve. Fear also dies in alleys, Grace said, and played him the audio of his own whisper from the hallway cam Grace had placed on a hunch 2 nights ago. The sting they hadn't yet named or used. His voice, thin and eager. Make it happen. He went paler than men like him consider dignified. That's out of context, he said. There is no kind context for that sentence, she said, and left him counting his remaining contexts like chips. What refused to fit was not who. It was why the hands chose tools so different for bodies that served the same performance. Most killers find a comfort. This one found a palate. Emily's strangulation had body heat all over it. Peter's death loved a prop. Sophie's push required timing and a corridor. Noah's poison asked for a kitchen, a recipe, a patience that looked like art. Back at the lab, Grace spread photos like tarot and asked them to agree. What they gave her instead was a stronger motive. This wasn't a serial fetish, it was a live show. Reed's money and vanity required novelty. Vega's philosophy required demonstration. Leo's training required practice and then the rush of the hand that goes from wax to skin and finds the same resistance. She circled a phrase on her pad until the ink nearly broke the paper. Control disguised as reverence. The residues, bay rum and lanolin, were not afterthought but contempt. The offender walked from gallery to victim without changing his smell because he believed the smell made him sacred. The variation in method was not mistake. It was programming. Each death taught the mask a new word and taught the donors that the gallery could still surprise. Evan Ward slipped into the room with a report that bent the air toward verdict. Vega's cuff, he said, holding an evidence bag. From the night Peter died, the tiny wax flake in the stitching matches are blend by FTIR, and a trace of copper particulate consistent with the bronze stand. He wore the scene like cologne. And Emily's nails? Grace asked. Bayrum matches the custom blend we found in his office. Pimenta ratios a little off from retail. He flavors his ghosts. And Noah's tox? Pure enough to be instruction, Ward said. Not a cook's mistake. Someone learned the safe dose and then ignored it by inches. There's a worksheet in Vega's kitchen drawer with calculations in his hand. He doesn't run risks. He runs rehearsals. Grace looked at the wall where she had mapped lives to rooms and rooms to faces. She drew a final arrow, methods audience. If murder is a language, this one was bilingual, one tongue for killing, another for selling the echo. She would need to split that tongue in interview until both halves confessed to belonging to the same mouth. She closed her notebook with a soft violence. The mass case was no longer about miracles or predictions. It was about a man who believed faces should obey him in death because they had not obeyed him enough in life, a patron who believed fear was philanthropy, and a boy who believed precision made him safe. The cause of death didn't fit until you remembered the cause was never death. It was attention. Take the residues to charge, Bayrum blend to Vega, wax flake and bronze to Peter's night, lanolin thumb to Sophie's collar, tetrodotoxin recipe to Vega's kitchen. Press Leo on soften her walk, and shift Reed from patron to instigator by playing him himself. Then set the sting, another face, another prediction. and let the theater go live under arrest lights. Charles Reed collected causes the way some men collect knives, admiring the edge more than the purpose. His apartment sat high enough to watch the ocean pretend to mind its business. Grace returned with a folder that made conversation unnecessary and still insisted on talking. "You fund Vega's expansions," she said, taking the seat that faced the sea, not him. "You underwrite evening salons. You transfer small, patient amounts to Leo Brooks labeled after-hours maintenance. You own a duplicate of the Courtyard Key." Reed poured himself water as if it were proof of virtue. "One must enable what one believes in," he said. "Martin's gallery moves people. People also move into morgues," Grace said. "Let's look at your movement." She laid out the car GPS downloads the warrant had bought her. Reed's luxury sedan obeyed its own record-keeping with the dutifulness of a chauffeured saint. "2 murder nights," she said, tapping the dots. "Your car stops within half a block of Vega House at 041 and 103. You turn the engine off, stay 11 minutes the first night, 14 the second. Your casino alibi covers the before and after, but there are intermissions." He shrugged. "I step out for air. You step out for RF," Grace said. She set down the RF sniffer log from the gallery hallway, thin spikes singing at the same frequency the piano bench remote loved. Time-stamped 044 and 107. Whoever warmed the masks did it while the door stayed locked. Someone with a remote. Someone eager to watch. Reed took a drink he didn't need. "I like to document," he said. "My clients are generous. They appreciate a bespoke experience." "Clients?" Grace repeated, and slid across printed messages from his phone. Notes to Vega with the vocabulary of a man who thinks taste can absolve appetite. "Make the faces speak. Tonight is good for an audience. Donors want intensity. And to Leo, doors at 2300 hours. Maintenance after hours. We need wakefulness." He smiled a little at his own words. "Art requires a patron," he said. "Patrons require testimony. Patrons also require keys," Grace said, and set a photograph of the copy he carried in a leather sheath. "Your key, Mr. Reed, opens the courtyard at 042 on the night Emily died and at 104 on the night Peter did. The reader logs show your card swiped earlier to test the clock. Time drift introduced and corrected. You like the architecture to flatter you." He didn't ask how she knew. Men like Reed understand that questions are receipts. "I visit," he said. "Sometimes Martin needs help convincing people what they're seeing is important. He has you whisper make it happen near vents wired to obey a remote," Grace said. "Important becomes murder adjacent when you prefer the room warm." "Prove murder," Reed said softly, and there it was, the floorboard that gives. "Let's talk Noah," Grace said. She placed the burner text on the glass table. "Keep receipts shut or they'll make the gallery sing." The prepaid number traced to a bulk purchase Reed's assistant made on a Wednesday afternoon. Security footage, credit card slip, the whole small crime solvent. The boy texts a warning to a number you own. 2 hours later, a neutral mask gets warmed into his last look, and he dies behind a club where you've also been seen pressing cash into a chef's hand for a demonstration fish. Your car loiters. Your camera rolls. Your messages call it a live piece. Reed looked at the ocean as if it owed him a line. "You're being literal," he said. "And vulgar." "Bodies are literal," Grace said. "And vulgar when you step over them to get better footage." He put the glass down exactly where a coaster would have been if his mother had one. "You don't understand donors," he said. "They want to feel something. They pay to feel something. Martin delivers. The city has galleries by the dozen, but only one that understands nerve." "The nerve," she said, "of thinking pain is philanthropy." He tilted his head. "You'll alienate culture, Ms. Navarro. Culture can learn to be lonely," she said, rising. "You'll come to the station and lend me your phone for a polite hour." He began to object. The warrant did the talking. She left him to his view and moved through a day that obeyed the tempo of a tightening net. At the station, the digital forensics tech mirrored Reed's device while Grace walked the timeline with a finger she would have liked to be a blade. Messages spooled out that belonged to midnight more than morning. Stage the blank under the back wall. The journalist piece would sing, "We need a shock." The journalist caught her attention the way a story catches a match. Reed had pitched a future victim to Vega, an investigative writer who had sniffed around Reed's charities and found the odor instructive. Reed wanted a mask to speak his fear before anything else did. Grace leaned on the table and watched the language corrode the man. "You don't commission death," she said. "You commission prefaces. You believe the rest will write itself because the city is obedient when money has a plan." He stared at the wall where a framed map of Havana pretended not to be evidence. "You still have to prove hands," he said soft. "Hands like heat leave prints," she said. "And hands like yours write checks that glow in the dark." She left him and returned to Vega House, where Leo had turned smaller, like a photograph left in the sun. "He pays you after hours," she said, and showed him the transfers. "He tells you what to wake. He tells Martin who to invite." Leo's face rearranged itself the way faces do when guilt meets an exit sign. "I warm what I'm told," he said. "He's there, it's all." "Triangle," Grace said. "Money, method, mirror." Vega, brought into the same discussion, tried to lean on dignity and found it had been sawn halfway through. "Charles believes in the gallery," he said. "Charles believes in watching fear make itself," Grace said. "And you believe in being the knife without admitting you cut." He opened his hands. "Prove a cut," he said. "Men like him prefer challenges to questions." "Emily's thumbnail says hello," Grace said. "Peter's beard says you swung what you worship. Sophie's collar says you don't change skin before you push. Noah's kitchen says your handwriting knows doses. Your bench says you like to touch an up arrow 6 minutes at a time." Vega's mouth did that almost smile, almost wince he wore when a mask lined up with its overlay. "And still," he said, "you must demonstrate." "That was always the plan," Grace said. "You love demonstration." She stepped outside to the courtyard and let the heat settle her thoughts. If the case's logic had a heartbeat, it was this. The gallery produced spectacle to summon money, and money summoned spectacle to believe in itself. The murders were not accidents but episodes. What a jury would need, and what Vega himself couldn't resist, was a live show under conditions that replaced saints with arresting officers. Let him try to predict again. Let Reed arrive with his private key and his whisper. Let Leo warm what's blank. Let the room confess into devices that did not care about art. She called her supervisor and asked for a sting with a name that would pull the right eyes. "We stage a fifth face," she said. "Blank plaster, back wall, zone C. We leak that a journalist, Reed's favorite grievance, is sniffing around. We go live at night. We watch the RF. We log the heater. We film the hands." Her supervisor considered the risk, the optics, the inevitable cry of entrapment, and then considered what Vega had already turned the city into, an unpaid theater for grief. "Do it," she said. "But hold the line, we don't ask them to kill. We let them stage. That's their religion." Grace drafted the false leak in a tone that would itch Reed where he lived. A blog post from a real journalist's byline, after permission and an informally delighted cackle, claiming to have found donors laundering status through suffering art at Vega House, promising a piece tomorrow. She had cybercrimes seeded in the right channels where patrons like to be scandalized in private. Then she set the room. The gallery door stayed sealed under red tape that held but could be taught to forgive. Inside, she mounted a new blank mask at the back wall and laced the baseboards with sensors that would register air's smallest betrayal. She planted a pinhole camera in a vent that watched the floor like a cat. She tuned her RF sniffer to listen only for the bench's old frequency and its siblings. She signed 2 officers to the mechanical closet and told them to hold like saints until the duty cycle rose. She sat an unmarked car with a view of the courtyard door and told the team to memorize Reed's body language. Vega watched the preparations with the focus of a man seeing a blank page that wants to be a book. "You're staging," he said, unable to keep admiration out of the accusation. "I'm preserving," she said. "You stage. I archive." "And the journalist?" he asked, too quickly. "Public record tomorrow," she said. and watched his eyes move to the bench and then away as if his gaze wore fingerprints too. The city fell into evening with the practiced sigh of a chorus that knows its cue. Grace took her place in the hallway, the sealed door at her shoulder, her radio in her palm, her pencil in her pocket like a talisman against deciding too soon. At 22:50, the RF scanner breathed softly. At 23:14, it pinged, the bench's pet frequency, alive and vain. In the closet, a voice came over the radio with the joy of a graph finding its hill. "Controller spike," the officer said. "Zone C to 58. Output 61%. Pulse mode." The reader stayed dark, no door. The tape stayed unbroken, no entry. And yet the gallery warmed at a single mask's feet. A silhouette slid through the courtyard gate with the stealth of money. Another followed with caution learned from cleaning. A third, last, with ritual. Grace steadied her voice so it would sound like anyone's. "Hold," she said. "Let them think prediction is safe. Go hot on the sting. Catch Leo with the wand, Reed with the camera and the whisper, Vega with the remote and the chant. Then move, freeze the theater and separate performance from murder under lamp and law." The house learned the hour before the clocks did. Heat settled into the corridors, and the shutters took their positions like eyelids preparing to lie. Grace stood in the seam where the gallery's sealed door met the hallway's painted certainty and felt the building breathe through wood. The sting had the quiet of a prayer you don't want answered. At 23:08, the RF sniffer ticked, then went shy, then ticked again like a throat clearing behind velvet. The mechanical closet officers came up on the radio with the restraint of men reading numbers as if they were weather. "Controller shows arm," one said. "PID alive. Zone select cursor hovering C." "Hold," Grace said and lifted her pencil. She did not write. Sometimes you keep a hand occupied so it won't touch a gun too early. The courtyard's gate unfurled its well-bred squeak. The first figure slid through, a silhouette slender and uncertain, the gait of a man who has learned to carry other people's intentions. Leo Brooks. He pressed himself into the shadow of the wall and let his eyes adjust, then ghosted along the corridor toward the sealed door. 2 minutes later, a second shape arrived with the composure of money disguised as caution. Charles Reed wore a jacket that would have been at home anywhere that required forgiveness and carried a camera that promised to make this private. He paused beneath the arch as if the house owed him a moment of framing, then moved to the piano like a man greeting a pet he pretends not to own. His hand felt for the bench's underside by memory that wasn't supposed to exist. Nothing there now, only adhesive ghost. He frowned, adjusted, and withdrew a second device from his pocket. A slim RF transmitter dressed as a key fob, engraved like a toy made for an adult child. He tapped it once and tilted his head toward the vents the way men tilt their heads toward chandeliers in churches. At 23:14, the closet officer's voice found brightness. "Zone C spike, set point 58. Duty 62. Pulse 1 per 2 seconds. Target diffuser back wall." "Copy," Grace said, and felt the house confess through the wood. She kept the door sealed. Let the heat right first. Leo produced a small tool roll and a microfiber cloth like a magician producing innocence. He knelt by the bottom gap to the gallery door and slid the cloth under with 2 fingers. Insurance. If any dust fled, it would catch. He lifted the corner of the red tape as carefully as if it were skin and made a millimeter cut with a razor so slim it wouldn't show unless you were the sort of person paid to notice. He exhaled a small apology and eased inside. Reed stayed in the hall, camera raised to the grid of tiny holes Grace had drilled into the vent cover earlier, the house's new confessional. The lens gathered the room and made it minor. Reed whispered for himself, for his donors, for the future where memory and money rhyme. "Make it happen," he breathed, and the microphone the size of a freckle in the vent's lip caught his eagerness like a fish. Grace let 30 seconds pass, then 60. Patience isn't a virtue here. It's a tool sharper than the ones Leo carried. Inside the gallery, the pinhole camera fed a clean black and white to Grace's phone. The blank mask on the back wall, the low convection of warmed air painting the baseboard in soft rivers. Leo's silhouette stepping into frame. He wore nitrile gloves. He set down the roll, unrolled it, and chose the wand with the narrow ceramic tip the way a pianist chooses a chord. He thumbed the portable power supply with a familiarity that came from repetition, not instruction. He warmed the air an inch off the left eyelid until the wax developed that damp look warm things acquire just before they decide to change. His other hand brought a rounded spatula to bear, and in a motion that would have looked like tenderness if tenderness went to school, he drew the lid's edge down 4 millimeters. He made a second pass, lighter, feathering the curve. He stepped back, compared with an overlay he pulled from his pocket. A transparency he pinned to a clamp lamp and held up to the mask like a benediction. The mouth was still neutral. He set the wand along the philtrum and breathed warmth into the upper lip until the cupid's bow lost its firmness. Then he turned to the lower lip and, with a practical cruelty, traced the inner arc with a pressure that promised enamel. A cut without blood. A bite you give yourself when breath is learning to fail. Grace could hear the wand hiss in her head, though the audio stayed true to the vent's hushed view. Heat, hands, pressure. The trifecta making a prophecy. Reed filmed, whispering to no one. Yes, there. That's it. Keep it. Keep it. A third presence entered the courtyard with the gravity of a man who expects rooms to volunteer their secrets. Martin Vega, linen open at the throat, the smell of bay rum traveling with him like a rumor. He paused under the arch, every gesture choreographed for a mirror. He saw Reed, gave the smallest nod, and slid into the hall. The bench where his remote had once lived received his hand. He found only the flat of absence. A flicker crossed his mouth. A small professional annoyance at a misplaced tool, then disappeared. He reached into his pocket and drew out a second fob slimmer, polished by use. He pressed. In the closet, the duty cycle stepped up like applause. Zone C-65, the officer said. Set point steady. Vega stepped to the gallery door and touched the tape at the edge like a man touching a lover's sleeve. He did not break it. He pressed the join lightly, felt the tack of fresh adhesive, smiled at the deception, and leaned in to the crack Leo had made. He did not enter. Leo worked. Vega directed with silence so confident it needed words only as garnish. Candle, Vega murmured finally. So soft it would have fallen if the microphone hadn't been hungry. Leo lit a match, let it burn to scent, and blew it out with a deliberate breath that sent a warm taint through the room. Ritual without flame. Theater without fire risk. Grace held up a hand to the team behind her. 2 uniforms, a tech, a cameraman whose camera was a pen, and flattened her palm. Not yet. Let the chorus reach the line. Inside, Leo lifted the overlay of a face that did not belong to any of the dead. The journalist, the one Reed wanted punished by preface. The transparency had the measured cruelty of geometry. He pinned it to the lamp, checked the alignment marks, pupils, mouth corners, lash line, and nodded to himself like a student who no longer needs the teacher's approval. He warmed the mask's right cheek and drew a shallow crease from the nose's base toward the mouth's corner, the beginning of a grimace. He deepened the inner lower lip just enough to show a crescent. He softened the upper eyelids until they looked tired in a way fatigue doesn't own. Reed couldn't help himself. Beautiful, he whispered. It sings. Vega, not touching anything, breathed words in a low rhythm that had more to do with power than prayer. The syllables didn't matter. The cadence did. Direct, pace, possess. Grace thought of the neighbor's drums and understood the percussion. Not religion, but metronome. That's enough, Grace said, and the corridor obeyed. She drew a box knife and slid it under the tape seam in one clean, decisive motion, popped the latch and pushed the door inward on its hush. The gallery lay in a chiaroscuro stage, edges crisp, intentions sharper. Leo froze with the wand midair. Reed dropped the camera a fraction and blinked like a man whose seat at the opera has just become a row at an arraignment. Vega turned, already rearranging his face to the expression this moment deserved. Concern, dignity, confusion. Pick one, wear it well. Police, Grace said, because ritual matters in both directions. Hands where I can see them, tools down. Nothing warms. The uniforms came past her like parentheses. One took the wand from Leo's hand. The other relieved Reed of his camera, which kept filming the ceiling, inventing art that didn't need him. A third officer lifted the RF fob from Vega's palm with the mild contempt you reserve for a liar's favorite adjective. "Don't touch the mask," Grace said, loud enough to make her point to the room and to the camera in the vent. "Scene is live." Leo's breath came shallow and fast, his eyes wide the way animals get when they discover what fences mean. "It's not," he started. "Speak later," Grace said, not unkindly, "while your hands remember how to rest." Reed found himself with an empty mouth. "This is entrapment," he said, choosing a word he had learned from a lawyer who charged by the hour. "It's observation," Grace said. "You warmed a blank into a person and asked the night to finish your sentence. We intervened between your clause and your period." Vega's voice was something he had tuned for irony. "You stage a scene and call us actors." "You staged a scene and called it truth," Grace said. "We are the exit lights." She directed the tech to photograph the mask as is. The eyelids softened, the nasolabial line coaxed into worry, the lower lip's inner arc ready to catch light. She had him swab the warm zones where tool had met wax, bag the wand tip while it still remembered heat, lift Reed's prints from the camera grip, and capture the RF traffic the fobs whispered to the controller. Packet IDs, timing, a handshake that would look familiar in court to anyone who had ever paired a garage door. "Mr. Vega," she said, turning to him, "you're under arrest for tampering with evidence, conspiracy, and, pending the lab's pleasure, multiple counts tied to the deaths your gallery rehearsed. You have the right." He held up a hand as if he were in a salon, not a crime scene. "Save the catechism," he said. "You'll find nothing of me on that mask." "You're on the room," she said, "and the room is on the dead." She had Reed cuffed for obstruction and solicitation and watched his face cycle through expressions he might have enjoyed if they were on someone else. She told Leo he would come downtown as a detained witness, then as a suspect, then maybe, if his mouth learned to tell the right truth, as a penitent who gets to go home sometimes. The mechanical closet team killed the PID and printed its final confession. Zone C had been driven by RF command to a duty cycle consistent with warming only the back wall diffuser. The sensor bead logged air at 58 Celsius within inches of the baseboard, while the room remained at 31. A map of the currents looked like the ghost of a hand. In the office, the bench sulked without its taped friend. Grace lifted the piano lid and pressed one key, a single note that did not deserve metaphor. The room had been a theater too long. It could stand an honest sound. They walked the three men out through the courtyard where heat made no one special and put them into cars that thought about air conditioning like Grace. The neighbor in the doorway watched with her arms folded across a life that had learned to ignore parades. She nodded at Grace. Grace nodded back. Some stories don't require more. At the station, separate rooms, separate versions. Reed tried to buy the truth new clothes. Vega attempted philosophy. Leo shivered in a way that made Grace think of cooling wax. Before dawn, Grace returned alone to the gallery to sign the evidence release to storage. The blank mask, now a half-learned face, sat under a portable cold draft and remembered anonymity by degrees. Up close, the tooling scars were beautiful in the way roads are beautiful from planes. Lines that admit to destinations without telling you who moved along them. She touched nothing. She let the room see her and not be seen. The piano kept its lid closed like a mouth that had finally chosen silence. She sealed the door one last time and wrote across the tape in a hand that never rushed. Navarro. Date. Hour. Her letters looked like someone else's certainty. Outside, the sky tried on a color between steel and milk. The city reset itself as if nights never happened. She breathed the morning until her pulse admitted it was done. Book them. Split the trio under interview. Leo first. Push force soften her walk. Reed with his own whisper. Vega with the remote print and the overlays. Draft the evidentiary map. RF to PID, wand to wax, residue to bodies. And carry it into the narrow rooms where guilt learns to answer to the right name. Interrogation rooms are clocks without hands. The light never changes. The chair legs don't learn empathy. Grace liked Room C because its wall camera had the patience of a librarian, and the door's squeak had been fixed by someone who believed in mercy. She started with Leo. He sat small, elbows tight to his ribs, fingers interlaced like a net that couldn't hold water. Someone had brought him a paper cup that sweated a ring onto the laminate. He hadn't drunk. "Leo," Grace said, putting the file down as if it weighed nothing. "I'm going to say what the room knows, and then you're going to fill in the part that keeps you human." His eyes moved to the corner where people think the camera lives. He found it. He nodded at the truth. "You retooled masks within 24 to 36 hours of deaths," Grace said, steady as a metronome. "You warmed nasolabial lines, lifted lids, cut inner lips with a rounded edge. Your heat wands match the microdrag. Your gloves carry bayrum and lanolin. The silicone negatives on your shelf are rehearsals. The fiber embedded in Sophie's I negative came from Noah's club shirt. You see where this goes. I made wax obey," he whispered. "You made wax confess to someone else's plan," Grace said. "Who told you Emily's grimace? Who handed you Sophie's eye angle? Who brought morgue stills on a stick and called them overlays?" "Mr. Vega," Leo said. It left him like a tooth. He said the city wanted honesty. Grace didn't lean in. She never leaned. "And the duct heater, the PID? You installed it, but who picked the zones and handled the remote while you worked?" He chewed his lower lip once, the way people do when they remember the taste of a bad decision. Mr. Vega liked to guide. Mr. Reed liked to watch. Sometimes Mr. Reed pressed the buttons. Sometimes Mr. Vega did. They argued about cadence, how fast the air should come. "Who touched the dead?" she asked softer. "Emily's throat. Peter's night with the stand. Sophie's fall. Noah's dose." Leo stared at the table. "I didn't," he said, and his voice had the flatness of a coin. "I wasn't there for that." Mr. Vega said he would keep the narrative aligned. He told me to make the masks truthful afterward. He called it repair. Grace let the word sit and rot. "Repair is for breaks," she said. This was choreography. He put his hands on the table, palms up, a small surrender. "He told me once to soften her walk," he said. "About Sophie. He said, we need her to move like she's made of tiredness." He gave me a bottle. He said it was a calmative. I poured a little into her soda when I talked to her at the archive. She blinked slower. I felt sick. I went home. The next day he stopped. The room breathed through the AC like a discreet ghost. "The lab will find the residues," Grace said. "It already has. Lanolin thumb on her collar. That's accessory assault. It isn't the push. Start writing that line between your act and his." He nodded, quick and miserable, and the floor under him stopped tilting. She left him with a stenographer who respected the shape of sentences and moved to room A, where Charles Reed had arranged himself into a pose that suggested this was a misunderstanding two adults could untangle over money. He had asked for water, then didn't drink. He had asked for counsel, then stalled choosing. He had asked for a better chair, then realized the room distributed discomfort democratically. "You commissioned," Grace said. "And you concealed. You gave keys and told clocks to lie. You filmed and whispered make it happen to vents wired to obey. You called a journalist a piece and asked for his fear in wax before he wrote a word. You paid Leo to keep nights open. You are not a murderer by hand. You are a murderer by appetite." He pinched his nose, a man allergic to consequences. "I never told anyone to kill," he said. "I asked for experiences. Martin promised theater. I assumed theater. You assumed the world would end at the proscenium," Grace said. "But you always sat behind the curtain. You knew what warmed, when, and why. Your car learns truth better than you do, Mr. Reed. This GPS gives you away. The RF logs sing your nights." He tried another face on bon vivant curdled into martyr. "Do you know what philanthropy is?" he asked. "A receipt for someone else's pain," she said. "Your transfers are little prayers to yourself, labeled restoration, while bodies went to the cold room." "I'll cooperate," he said quickly, the word like a life ring he threw himself. "I'll testify." Martin led. I followed. The boy, what's his name, he executed. I was hungry, Grace finished. Your cooperation buys you a smaller cell and a longer speech at sentencing. It doesn't buy you amnesia. She slid the consent form across, watched him sign a narrow name, watched the ink dry like a door. You'll give me your donors, too, she said. Everyone who paid to be moved. That will hurt, he said, because he needed someone to notice. That is the point, she said, and left him to learn silence. Martin Vega in room B had asked for nothing. He sat like a man listening to a late quartet. Chin down, eyes up, a hand at his mouth as if catching a thought before it betrayed him. When Grace entered, he smiled like an usher. You have built quite a case, he said. I admire structure. You admire control, Grace said, taking the chair. Let me admire it with you. You bribed a porter for morgue stills. You turned them into overlays on a laptop that remembers your name. You installed a PID controller to heat single diffusers to 58 degrees, mask-only warming. You taped an RF remote under your bench. Your left thumbprint, scar crossing ridge 5, lives on the fob. You lit candles without fire to perfume the lie. You directed a boy's hands to draw fear into wax. You sold tickets to a man who whispers and calls it culture. He laced his fingers. You prefer that I am the villain, he said, because villains make endings easier. I prefer you as you are, she said. A man who can't stop arranging faces to agree with him. And the bodies? He asked, almost bored. Emily strangled with bay rum under her nail. Your blend's pimenta ratio is distinctive, Grace said. Peter struck with your bronze stand. Wax flakes in his beard, copper particulates on your cuff. Sophie pushed after your boy, softened her walk. Lanolin thumbprint on her collar, your night entries on her corridor's camera, edited logs in your security reader. Noah dosed with tetrodotoxin, recipe printout in your kitchen with your handwritten corrections, a worksheet for dosing and time to effect in your desk. Every murder wore your room's smell. He tilted his head, enjoyed a shadow on the wall. And yet, he said, rooms have many hands. You like plural when singular is inconvenient, Grace said. Let's try singular. Did you strangle Emily? He held her gaze and made a decision about who he was going to be for the next hour. No, he said. Did you swing the stand at Peter? No. Did you push Sophie? No. Did you dose Noah? Of course not. Who did? He smiled with a small pity meant for her education. The city, he said. The city orchestrates itself. I tuned. She set a photograph between them. The RF remote, dusted, the lifted print scar a white river through a black forest. You tuned, she repeated, while murder played. If you think a jury will care which finger pushed which button, you're mistaking their patience for yours. He let a silence expand to the size of ego and then said, You recorded last night. That was entrapment. That was an intervention, Grace said. We kept your theater from graduating to the alley. Your lawyers can play with nouns. The verbs survive. You warmed, you directed, you sold. He exhaled through his teeth. Not a sigh, not a laugh. You are righteous, he said. Righteousness is a kind of aesthetics. You should see your face when you draw lines. She picked up her pen. I like lines, she said. They lead home. He watched her write and couldn't help himself. What's the lead image in your report? He asked. You'll end it on something. Flourish. You're not immune. She looked at him the way one looks at a cracked mirror, aware of the multiplication of self. The image is a blank mask under cold air, losing its expression by degrees, she said. That's your legacy. A face remembering how not to be you. He didn't flinch, and that was a kind of confession too. By mid-morning, the lab had delivered the bytes she needed to finish cutting the rope. Leighton confirmed the scarred print on the RF remote to Vega's left thumb with a probability that made statisticians lean back satisfied. FTIR on the wax flake in Vega's cuff matched not only the gallery blend but a minor impurity, trace pine resin, that appeared in both his office polish and the flake, a signature no catalog would share. The custom Bayrum's essential oil ratios, clove heavy, allspice shy, matched the residue under Emily's nail. The tetrodotoxin worksheet in Vega's drawer carried indentations, and ESDA pulled ghost script from the sheet beneath. Noah 1.5 milligrams? / 30 to 45 minutes onset ***. Club kitchen. Ventilation. His handwriting cleaved to the curves like habit. Grace assembled the evidentiary map on a board the size of a door. Red strings were for method, blue for mechanism, black for money. A braid of all three tied at Vega's name. A lesser braid at Reed's. A loop at Leo's with a note. Accessory / assault / cooperation. When the prosecutor arrived with coffee and narrowed eyes, Grace walked the lines like a docent in a gallery that finally told the truth. RF to PID, she said, tapping one path. Remote recovered from bench. Vega's print. Logs show duty cycle spikes per zone. Nights match murders and rehearsals. Wand to wax. SEM microdrag. Tool mark signatures. Wand tip swabbed hot during sting. Residue to bodies. Bayrum blend to Emily. Wax flake plus copper to Peter. Lanolin thumb to Sophie. Tetro recipe to Noah. Intent. Overlays created on Vega's laptop. Silicone negatives as rehearsal. Patrons' messages pressing for prediction and intensity. The prosecutor smiled without pleasure. We can indict an opera, she said, and close the curtain. They filed charges before noon, punched the city in the shoulder. Martin Vega. Multiple counts of murder, evidence tampering, conspiracy. Charles Reed. Solicitation, conspiracy, obstruction. Leo Brooks. Accessory, assault, evidence tampering, with a provisional cooperation agreement shaped like a narrow bridge he could cross if he looked down only once. Grace went back to room C with the agreement in a folder that avoided flourish. This is a ladder, she told Leo. You climb it by telling me the parts that hurt to say. He signed like a person learning a new alphabet. He told me, he said, that art needed witnesses. He said the dead deserved their last truths drawn on their faces. He said I was careful. No one ever said I was careful before. You are, Grace said. Be careful now. In the bullpen, someone asked her if she would sleep. She thought about the gallery, about the smell of bayrum kinked into the vents, about the way the blank mask last night had begun to look like an argument she'd had with herself once. Later, she said, she wrote the last line of her narrative in a way that would read clean in a courtroom. Artifacts do not foresee. People's script. The wax changes because a hand expects it to. The deaths follow because that same hand refuses to stop. ***. Then she closed the file and felt the small relief of doors aligning. Hand the package to the court. Prep Leo for direct. Lock Reed into his cooperation, and take the case to endgame. A room of faces boxed, a gallery sealed, and a city that, for a little while, looks at walls and sees walls. The courthouse steps were a theater without music. Cameras kept their distance, learning manners from marble. Grace stood at the bottom while the day assembled itself around her. Buses breathing, pigeons negotiating treaties with crumbs. The ocean past the rooftops performing that old trick of looking endless. Inside, paper put on armor. Indictments, motions, exhibits. Outside, heat took the edges off news. The gallery was sealed now in a way tape alone couldn't manage. A court order like a lid. Movers came with white gloves and a respect that had nothing to do with reverence. They lifted heads the way one lifts a napping child, securely, without waking anything. Each mask took its number, its photograph, its position noted, its history becoming a file that would be dull on purpose. Grace signed the release and walked the rooms one last time. The mechanical closet slept. The controller was dark, its little red segments finally out of prayers. In the office, the piano kept its teeth hidden. The bench remembered nothing except wood. Bayrum had faded to a ghost that couldn't afford rent. She paused at the storage door, the one that had given up silicone negatives and a thread that hadn't belonged, and let her palm rest flat against the paint. Under her hand, only quiet. When a room stops speaking, it is either honest or empty. She preferred empty. At trial, the case unrolled with the steadiness of a careful hand. The jurors learned what wax is made of and how heat talks to it. They learned that PID was not theology but control. They learned that a scar crossing Ridge 5 can make a thumbprint sing a solo. They listened to a palynologist explain frangipani pollen and why a grain in a hairline can be a map. They listened to Ward pronounce tetrodotoxin without drama and with data. They watched overlays, the geometry of grief, appear on a screen and lose their art to purpose. Leo spoke first among the guilty because that had been the deal. He kept his eyes on the microphone, not on Vega. He described the heat wands, the practice casts, the nights where air lifted from baseboards like a trick he'd learned too well. He said the phrase, "soften her walk," once and then swallowed it, as if he could take it back into his mouth and keep it there where it would only bruise him. He said, "I thought precision was safety." Then he said, "I was wrong." Reed followed, wearing contrition like a new shirt that itched. He put his donors' names on paper. He let messages read themselves aloud. Asterisk asterisk make the faces speak asterisk asterisk. Tonight is good for an audience, and flinched at his own verbs. He said he never intended death. He said art. He said philanthropy. The room did not admire vocabulary. It admired proof. Vega sat through both like a critic with a good seat. When it was his turn, he chose poise. He denied touching. He denied pressing. He called the overlays studies, the heater stabilization, the remote convenience. He tried to elevate the nouns and lower the verbs. The prosecutor walked him through the fingerprints, the cuff flake, the ESDA lifted dosing notes, the bench's adhesive ghost. She asked him what music he had been playing in the gallery the night Zone C climbed to 58. He answered with a composer's name. She answered with a duty cycle graph. When the verdict came, it came without flourish. 12 faces practiced neutrality and then let it go. Guilty for Vega, stack by stack. Murder, conspiracy, evidence tampering. Guilty for Reed, solicitation, conspiracy, obstruction. Guilty for Leo, reduced, accessory, assault, tampering, with the kind of sentence that includes classrooms and apologies and the long, ordinary work of a man learning different verbs. The masks went to climate-controlled evidence where meaning goes to thin out. The saints lost their gleam. The criminals looked almost bored. Up close, under the honest light of a warehouse, the tooling scars showed themselves like healed cuts on a knee. Stories you could tell if you wanted to, or let grow pale until even the owner forgot how they happened. Grace filed her last supplement and returned to the gallery for the handover nobody else wanted. A locksmith had changed the cylinders. The courtyard no longer swallowed sound. It merely moderated it. She signed for 2 crates, one labeled practice casts, the other silicone negatives, to be transported to the lab's long-term room. The movers carried them the way one carries history, impersonally, with straps and tape. She kept one thing back from the box, a blank mask she had ordered made for the sting, now bagged and documented in nobody's, just plaster and potential. She set it on a rolling cart and pulled a portable cold fan into position, the kind used to halt time without damaging it. She turned the fan on low. Air stroked the face until the last softness went out of it. Vega's piano sat with its belly closed. She opened the lid and laid a single page on the rack. A photocopy of the heat logs, duty cycle, a neat procession of spikes and rests. She pressed one key and got a note that sounded like a line drawn with a pencil until the lead remembered to smudge. She closed the lid again. No music today. Not here. She wrote the one sentence she had promised herself to keep somewhere official, where no one could accuse her of poetry later. Artifacts do not foresee. People script. She placed it in her report under findings rather than closing remarks. Let it live in the hard part of the document, not the soft. On her way out, she met the neighbor at her gate. Laundry pins in her mouth, eyes like someone who had seen parades and never believed any of them were for her. The woman spat the pins gently into her palm. "Quiet," she said. "For now," Grace answered. The ocean had switched from tin to glass. Along the cemetery path at Cologne, a groundskeeper shook a tree, and the frangipani answered with white flowers that fell like tired hands. The city remembered its jobs. Cooks cooked, bartenders polished, archivists filed. Somewhere someone lit a candle for a reason that didn't need an audience. Grace went back to the lab because Endings, our admin ward, had the overlay files printed on heavyweight paper, the grids now inert, edges crisp enough to cut if you made them. He set the blank mask on the bench under the fan and nodded at it like a colleague. Good stillness, he said. She looked at the face without a name and saw what she wanted the city to learn. That neutrality can be a discipline, not a void. She could tell herself a story where this was closure and believe it just long enough to sleep. As she signed the last property receipt, her pen paused, then moved again. In the evidence cage, under clear film, the blank mask changed by degrees none of the instruments could quantify. Not a movement, only the way light revised its contract. Carnauba bloom surfaced as a matte film, natural, cosmetic, expected, and in that dulling there was a trick of shadow at the mouth, nothing more than what you get when a lip is a curve and a room remembers warmer days. For a heartbeat, if you leaned the wrong way, it looked like a tightening. She blinked and looked straight, and it was only physics being a little unscrupulous, as usual. She left the fan on. She turned off the light. She closed the lab door and wrote the time in a small box on her clipboard. The hour a face chose to remain a face and not a plot. On the drive home, the radio talked about weather and baseball and a festival that would smell like sugar. She turned it down and let the city hum. Windows open, evening holding. She caught the faintest afterscent from her jacket, bay rum, a memory that would need laundering. She decided to wash it twice and keep the jacket. At her apartment, she took the cheap whiteboard down, wiped the strings and names and rooms away with the slow patience of someone erasing a chalk outline. In the clean rectangle, she wrote 3 words in small letters at the bottom edge where only she would see them tomorrow. Heat, hands, pressure. Not as a warning, just as a taxonomy. It's good to know the parts of a thing if you mean to refuse it. In Havana's heat, faces soften. In certain rooms, so does conscience, until someone sets both. Tonight, there was no one holding a remote. The air moved because air moves. The city slept because cities must. Grace put the cap on her marker, put her hand flat on the empty board, and let it cool. The wax has cooled, the room sealed, and the story ends. But echoes stay, don't they? We've walked through Havana's heat, among faces that changed not by miracle but by hand. And in that still air, we learned what truth costs when art forgets mercy. If you've listened this far, thank you for your attention, your patience, and your courage to keep looking when the light starts to flicker. Every episode, we try to touch that fragile line between reason and fear, and you make that search worth it. Stay close for the next investigation from Somnolent Conspiracies, where every silence hides a signal, and every signal has a face. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more gripping audio stories. Keep your lights low, your mind sharp, and remember, some masks melt faster than lies.